Mother's Sermon. O Mother, hear our call. Cradle us to your breast. Birth us from your womb anew. Lend your womb to our call, that we may see eternity's crown. Journal, July 1st. I saw her today. She was with one of the faceless shadows who has complicated her. She must take her seat. Angela came awake groggily. She was being dragged across the concrete, and her heels were in agony. Someone had hold of her arms, and they were straining as they pulled her across the pavement. She tried to tear away from them, tried to free herself from the sweaty hands that tugged at her, but her arms were not under her control. Her legs hung limply, her heels leaving bloody paths on the concrete, but she found that she could not move either of them. She could see that it was night. Her pajamas were covered by a fluffy robe, and the garment was covered in mud and dirt. The front was open slightly, and the tops of her breasts were awash with goosebumps as the cold night air hit her. Her head wobbled slightly as she was dragged, and as it lulled to the side, she could see a storage park that ran in uniform rows to her left. How had she gotten here? She had been in her apartment, the apartment she shared with David last she knew. Her vision swam as she tried to come back to reality. She remembered lying down for the night. David was at work, of course, and just as she had gotten comfy, there was a knock at the door. Angela had looked up from the TV with irritation. It was 9 o'clock at night, for goodness sake. Who would possibly be at the door at this hour? She and David had only recently moved to the city, so they didn't know many people. David's job had required him to move, and with the money he'd be making, they could afford a much nicer apartment than they'd had. The trade-off was that they had to move away from their friends and family to a city they didn't know. Luckily, they had found an OB doctor they both liked, she thought as she stroked the swell of her belly. When her son was born, he would have much better options for school, much better than he would have had in her hometown. They could afford to send him to the finest daycares, the best private schools, the most prestigious colleges. There, he would meet the sort of people that would take him places, people who would ensure that he made something of himself, the kind of people who would... The person knocking had pulled her from her revelry. She threw the Afghan on the floor as she pulled herself from the couch and moved towards the door. She had pulled on her housecoat to hide her pajamas. They were a bit too exposing for her liking for entertaining strangers, and then waddled towards the door. She could see a man-sized shadow lurking behind the semi-translucent glass, but he didn't look particularly imposing. She could see a few strands of hair sticking up on his head, and as she neared the door, she could hear him switching his feet in a weird tattoo. She thought about just not answering him, but decided that that would be unchristian of her. Who is it?" she asked, and the weird stepping stopped. "Yes, ma'am. Sorry to bother you. My car broke down, and I was hoping I could use your phone." She scoffed. "You must think I was born yesterday. I'm not just going to open my door to someone with a sob story who I don't even know." There was silence on the stoop for a minute, and she wondered if he meant to stay the night. "I can sure understand that, ma'am. I was really just hoping to find a good Samaritan tonight, but I'll move on. I hope it's okay if I leave my car on the sidewalk in front of your house." He then started to leave her front porch. Angela felt a bit guilty. He was just looking for some help. The Bible did say one should always help someone in need. She could just pass the phone through the door. It was a cordless after all. Then he could just give it back when he was done. She opened the door a crack and called him back. He came back up the steps and thanked her profusely as she thrust the cordless phone through the crack in the door. "No problem. We all have to help each other out in this crazy..." She hadn't even felt the needle as it slid into her arm. She dropped the phone and heard it clatter to the stones of the porch. The sound might have been happening 1,000 miles away, though. As she gripped her arm, she felt lightheaded. She grabbed the wall, but it turned to rubber under her palms. The whole world started spinning, and she was thankful when she fell on her backside instead of her belly. That could have hurt the baby. She was also very thankful when the chain was still on, until the door crashed open, breaking the flimsy draw chain. The last thing she remembered was the man with the crazy hair framed in her doorway. Her heels ached pitifully. When she groaned out in pain, the person pulling her stopped. She hung in his hands, limp and lolling, wanting to leave but not in control of her body. He must have looked down at her and decided she was still out because the pulling recommenced. He stopped suddenly, rolling up the storage unit door as he pulled her inside. Once they were through, he laid her on her back, and the dim light from outside faded as he rolled the door closed. As he turned, she saw the same frizzy-haired man as before. He was bathed in a pale light that illuminated from behind her, and it made him look all the crazier. His glasses were askew, and his shirt was covered in sweat stains. He looked as though he'd just run a mile, and his face had a deep flush creeping up the neck that Angela didn't like. When he saw that her eyes were open, his expression became alarmed. "Oh no! You cannot see the throne yet, Mother. It's not time." He bent next to her, and she felt the prick of a needle as it entered her neck. "When you wake up, you'll be immortalized for the ages," he promised. She tried to object, but found herself floating off again as she drifted on a cloud of ethereal sleep. When she woke, she was surrounded by lights. Candles burned in 1,000 places, and the room defied explanation. The crazy bastard had built what appeared to be an altar from cast-off items. It was silver, but not genuine silver. The silver came from discarded gum wrappers, silver wrapping paper, the old chrome of hubcaps, and the new shine of car fenders, lovingly worked into an altar fit for a madman. It sat on a pedestal made of old pallets, and on top was the likeness of an abomination. Its shape defied men, its dimensions hurt her eyes, and as she met its eyes, she felt them judge her flesh. The creature looked as though it had been gouged from solid rock, formed deep in the earth over thousands of years, and the eyes were burning coals from the depths of the earth. It stared at her, and in her foggy state, it almost seemed to move, to breathe. The longer she looked at it, the more uncomfortable it made her, and as she looked away, she saw the thrones. Thrones was the only word she knew that did them justice, but they were no real thrones. They too were crafted from junk. Here the twisted body of a child's bike, there the crumpled shine of a garbage can. She saw bike wheels and car tires, children's toys and seniors' walkers, garbage can lids and wooden coffee tables, all made sacrifice to these hulking thrones. Whoever had crafted them had used a blowtorch, their edges welded together like a patchwork monstrosity. As she looked around, she feared that she might be in one herself. She tried to move, but found herself incapable. Her hands were secured in such a way that they wouldn't move at all. Her legs were encased in something rigid and unmoving. Her stomach hurt. Her stomach was on fire, but she couldn't move her head to see the cause. Her eyes darted here and there, trying to see how she might escape, and all the while, she heard the scrape of a trowel. The sound was constant, monotonous, and seemed to be coming from just out of her field of vision. It was followed by the wet plop of something being dropped onto something else. Then the trowel scraped. She jerked her arms again, but they stayed put. He had tied her much too tightly, but it didn't feel like ropes. Her legs wouldn't move at all, and that, coupled with the sensation from her belly, was making her very nervous. She needed to get out of here. She needed to make sure that her baby was safe. She needed David to come and rescue her from this awful man. He came around the front then and smiled at her. "Ah, there you are, Mother. Welcome to the Eternity Chapel. Beautiful, isn't it? I have strived for you tirelessly," he said, turning to the strange totem on the altar. "Stolen for you, worked for you, killed for you." He breathed the last word and looked to her left as though afraid of something naughty he had done. She turned her eyes, and if she'd been able to scream, she would have. Sitting in the chair, its body encased in plaster, was a skeletal head that protruded from the plaster hood that encased it. Its face looked ancient, like a mummy. The hair hung in withered strands, and it was evident that this person had been dead for a long time. The man flew into a rage when he saw the desiccated thing. He stomped over to the plaster mummy and waggled a finger at him. The tableau would have been funny under any other circumstances. At the moment, it just seemed horrific in its familiarity, as though it was a scene that had been strutted out 1,000 times before. "Father, where are your manners? We have a guest. How dare you show up without your face?" He reached down to the foot of the shiny throne and found what he was looking for amongst the detritus. He raised a porcelain mask and wiped the dirt from it before thrusting it back onto the mummy's face. The mask was that of a stern man, and the brows looked on with disappointment. The edges of the mask had been meticulously worked with nails and pins, so the mask would stay in place as he pushed it against the plaster. He brought the trowel and bucket over so he could put a fresh coat of plaster over it. He turned back to her a moment later, satisfied with his work, but Angela would bet that Father would need a new coat before the week was out. That was one man who didn't like to go quietly in the face of his murderer. The old man smiled at her. "Don't mind Father. He's been cranky ever since he ascended. He sits on the council now, as you will once I've finished your death mask. There's no higher calling." "Please, you have to let me go," Angela begged as he returned to his work. "You've made a mistake. I have a baby inside of me. I need to leave and make sure he's okay." Her words sounded lame and slurry even in her own ears. She needed to get out of here, though, needed to make sure her baby was okay. She didn't know what had been in those needles, but she needed to make sure that it hadn't hurt her baby. The old man tutted. "Your chap has already been taken care of. The mother must be a birther to the whole world. She hasn't time for some low-born churl. But worry not, for I've given him a place at your breast forever." At her breast? She craned her head down, trying to see why her guts were in such an uproar, and that's when she saw him. She was 8.5 months along, almost ready to pop. He had been a big boy, a healthy boy like his father. His little plaster face was angelic, his little hands laid against her swollen breast. He looked so peaceful in death. Her horror at what lay below was slightly muted after seeing her unborn child. He had ripped her open, her guts spilling out onto the floor as they hung outside her belly, and he had cut the baby from her living flesh. Her womb was now barren and wide open. She would never give birth to another child. She would never birth anything. She should be dead. He was encasing her in a hood of plaster now. She was becoming claustrophobic, the darkness creeping in around her. She tried to thrash her head, but it wouldn't move. Her neck felt wobbly, and she realized it wasn't just the drugs in her system. She was dying. He had opened her belly and removed her child. She should be dead already. Every breath she took was on borrowed time. As the hood was finished, she heard him place something on top, and was aware of the strands of hair around the edges of her vision. She saw him standing before her throne, looking at his handiwork. "Mother, you look gorgeous. There's only one thing missing before you're complete." He turned and picked something up off the table. He turned it so she could see it. It was a mask, of course. The lips were painted a whorish shade of red. The rouge over the eyes was too thick, and the small nose made the whole face look pinched. As she swam her last minutes out, she thought the face reminded her of her mother, tarted up, always trying to gain her father's attention, and he only had eyes for girls barely out of high school. Behind that makeup was a sour bitch, though, and Angela had been on the receiving end of her mother's wrath more than once. Her final thoughts were that she did not want to look like her mother for all eternity. As the mask fit in place, leaving her in darkness, she slipped away forever. Interlude: The Pursuer. Detective Julius sat at his desk, nursing a pounding headache. The phone rang, but he let it go to the receptionist. His head was pounding like an engine in an old truck, and goddamn if he couldn't feel it behind his eyes. He reached into his desk drawer without looking and pulled out a bottle of aspirin. He dry swallowed 4 of them and laid his head back down. "Jules, it's for you," called Casey as she swiveled her chair away from the reception desk. "If it's David Hesker again, tell him that we haven't found his wife in the last 2 hours since he called. Tell him to sit down, take a Valium, and settle the hell down before he gives me an aneurysm." Casey wheeled away, and he heard her giving Mr. Hesker a blanket statement about how they were trying their best and how they were taking his case very seriously. Jules sighed. He had spent all morning talking to David Hesker, taking statements from neighbors, pulling prints, and investigating the scene for clues. They had called and asked and beat on every door in a 3-block radius, and they were no closer to finding Angela Hesker than they had been this morning. The witness statements all read about the same. At some time after 9 p.m., neighbors had heard a loud crash as someone kicked in the door to the Hesker home. That was impossible, David stated, because the locks on the doors would have thwarted such an attempt. Locks or no locks, the door had been kicked in, and if the neighbors heard it, they turned up their TVs and ignored the sound. In this city, it did not pay to be a good Samaritan. Good Samaritans often went home in body bags. Julius had thought it an open and shut case from the start. They had fingerprints, they had a pry bar that someone had left on the porch, and that would find them a name. He had assured Mr. Husker that they would do everything in their power to find his wife and bring her home safe. What that entailed, he wasn't sure yet, but 16 hours later, he had found nothing. The prints came back quick, and he thought that was good. It turned out they had come back quick because they matched no existing prints. "What are you telling me? We don't have this guy's prints on file?" Jules had asked. The tech had shrugged. "Not every set of prints is on file, you know. It's actually just offenders and people whose kids got printed in school in case they went missing. Hell, 85% of America wouldn't show up on this search. All this means is that your guy is probably older and probably hasn't committed a crime before." When he'd been given this info, David had already called him twice. "Mr. Hesker, for me to get the police work done, I'm going to have to get off the phone with you and do some work. I was just hoping you'd found her by now. I was thinking about people she knew, and well, she goes to this Korean nail salon all the time. I know some of those people are mixed up with shady stuff. Maybe one of them wanted a baby for an organ harvest, or..." Julius sighed. "Go home, Mr. Hesker. Go sit down and try not to give yourself a stroke. We're doing everything that we can." That had been a lie. He was doing everything the police department could do. The days when he could shake down suspects and kick in doors on hunches were gone. Leave that to the PIs and the state boys. No, police protocol was very clear on what he could do. Not much. He had beat the bushes out all day. All the witness statements had been useless. All leads had gone to nothing. Jules had nothing to go on and nothing to help move his case along. When the phone rang on his desk, he picked it up on reflex. "Mr. Hesker, if you don't stop calling me, I will..." "Hello? Is this Detective Julius?" said a timid female voice. The speaker was not David Hesker for a change. "Yes, this is Detective Julius. I'm sorry, it's been a long day. How can I help you?" "You came by my house today, asking about that woman that had been abducted." "Yes, did you have some information?" "Well, it may be nothing," she said, sounding unsure of herself. Jules took a pencil and licked the tip as he picked up a notepad. "I'd like to hear it anyway." "Well, there was a man hanging around last night." "Can you describe him?" Julius asked, trying to keep the woman talking. "About 5'6", not heavy, but not thin. He had gray hair. It was all wild on his head. He wore glasses and old clothes." "And what time did you see him loitering around the Hesker residence?" "That's just it. The man wasn't just around their house. He was pacing the street on their block. I went to walk Samson, my dog, and I saw him just pacing up and down. It seemed odd because every time he passed that woman's house, he looked at the front door before starting to pace again." What time was this, ma'am?" "Oh, about 6 o'clock, I guess. I don't remember if I saw him after that." Julius rolled his eyes and tore the description off the pad. "Thank you very much, ma'am. I'm glad you called." He hung up then and curled up the description and threw it away. Another statement in the T file. Grandpa and I were sitting at the local flea market, selling his woodwork like any typical Saturday. It was springtime in the Appalachians, and like a bear from its den, the flea market had returned from its long sleep. Despite all the folksy knickknacks and other things for sale at the market, Grandpa usually does pretty well for himself. The tourists really seem to like his intricate bears and beavers and wolves that he carves. He has walking sticks, a favorite amongst the hikers in the area, bowls, key holders, other sort of accent pieces that tourists and locals come back for year after year. Many of his carvings grace the homes of locals, and the crowd around his stall is never fewer than 3 or 4. Grandpa was just finishing chatting with random customers when he suddenly told me that this reminded him of how he and his grandmother used to come to the flea market. "Oh, did she sell magic potions?" I asked, laughing a little at the thought of these super religious stump thumpers picking up love potions and wart begone. "Sometimes. She also sold herbs, folk remedies, and poultices to people who were in need of them. She never dabbled in things like dream catchers or love potions, things she considered hokey. She only dealt in what she knew, and what she knew came from the woods." His face clouded a little as he thought, and When next he spoke, it was with discomfort. "I almost died here when I was young. Did you know that?" My head snapped around so hard I thought my neck might crack. "What?" "I was old enough to know better than to have let it get that far, but that didn't stop me from nearly getting taken by it." "Taken by what?" I asked, not sure I wanted to know, but needing to know all the same. "Soap Sally," and when he said it, the name was almost a whisper. It was as though he was afraid to say it too loudly, lest she be summoned by it. "Who?" I half laughed, thinking he was joking with me. Grandpa looked shocked. "Didn't your parents ever tell you about Soap Sally?" I shook my head. "Not that I can ever remember." "I taught your mother better than that. Soap Sally is dangerous, especially to children." "Well, you can always tell me about her now." Grandpa nodded, grumbling in disbelief that I'd never heard, and collected his thoughts. "All of it began with a candle." Grandma handed me a small burlap sack, one of Grandma's little sigils attached to the top. The sigil was to prevent sickness, a simple collection of severe swoops, and I looked up at her questioningly. We had been at the stand all day, selling Grandma's wares, and it wasn't the first time she had sent me out to make a delivery. "Take this to Sybil, would you? She's over by the man selling corn on the far end of the market. Her husband is sick, and she's hoping that this will take away the gloom hovering around him." "Sure," I said, turning to go, but Grandma wasn't quite done yet. "It's nearly sunset, so hurry back. I don't want you getting lost in the end-of-day exodus from this place." "I won't," I promised, and left to find Miss Sybil. I knew who she was, of course. She came around sometimes to get poultices and cures for various things. Though a devout Baptist, Miss Sybil claimed that Dr. Jared's medicine just didn't have the same kick that Grandma's backwoods medicine did. I worked my way through the crowd, stepping quickly around men in boots and overalls as they hauled away everything from animal skins to blades for their harrows. The flea market was a great place to find anything, and I found myself looking at a few booths as I walked past. One of them had some beautiful wooden toys, another selling handmade yo-yos, and a third selling the last of their lead soldiers, lovingly painted to look like Civil War soldiers, for only a penny each. I had a few pennies jingling in my pocket, but as I stepped towards the booth, I knew that Grandma would be mad if I dallied. I'm sure that the booth would be open when Grandma gave me the promised 20 cents at the end of the day. Maybe Miss Sybil would even give me a tip, I thought eagerly. The market was busy, though by the time I reached Miss Sybil's booth, she was preparing to leave. She looked up smiling as she recognized me, and thanked me for coming all this way with her candle. "My husband has been sick for days, and I know he'll be happy to get back to the woods. Here's a little something for your trouble, young man," she said, handing me a few pennies for my trouble. Along with the pennies I had in my pocket, that made 10 whole cents. In that day, that was practically a fortune. As I made my way back, I took a turn towards the table with the lead soldiers. I wanted some new Confederates for the little army I already had at home, and I didn't figure Grandma would be too mad if I made a little detour after her delivery was done. I had just gotten to the end of the row when I heard someone struggling with something. It sounded like a woman, and as I looked towards the outskirts of the West Market, I could see an elderly woman struggling to push a wheeled cart towards the parking lot. I looked back the way I had come, wanting to get to the booth before it closed, but I was a good boy, and I had been raised to help people if they needed help. I approached the old woman and asked if I could help her. She turned to regard me, and I immediately wished I hadn't asked. She was tall, and her width seemed to match her height. She was dressed in a thick coat, much too warm for the day, and a wide-brimmed hat that covered her face in a perpetual shadow. Even so, her face was toadish, oddly long, with skin that looked doughy. She looked like nothing so much as a candle that had grown soft on a warm day. When she smiled, I remembered thinking that her teeth were made of sewing needles, but then I realized that they were just thin and slightly pointed. Everything about her made me suddenly uncomfortable, and I wanted nothing so much as to run away. But, again, I was a good boy, and good boys did not judge people by the way they looked. "Well, aren't you a helpful young man?" she said, her voice sweet but wrong somehow. Her voice seemed unnatural, like a particularly well-done bit of ventriloquism, and it only added to her sense of not rightness. "The wheel is just a little stuck in this rut," she said, showing me the pothole that the delicate wheels of her cart had gotten stuck in. "Do you think you could help me push it? A strong young man like you probably could help me get it loose." I smiled and nodded, pushing one of the sides as the two of us strained against the bulky old cart. It was heavy, the insides rattling with whatever she was selling, and I could smell a flowery smell coming from the inside. I wondered if she was selling flowers, or maybe soap, but as the cart suddenly lunged forward, I stumbled a little and smacked my head against the side of it. I saw stars for a moment and sat down on the red clay with a thump. As she loomed up before me, I could see her doubling in my vision as she offered me a hand. "Are you okay, young man?" I reached out shakily for her hand, telling her I was okay, before her fingers became iron and she settled them around my wrist. I was yanked up, my head spinning, as she began to drag me behind her cart. She was dragging me like a donkey lashed behind a wagon, and I was having trouble getting my thoughts together. My head hurt, my vision swam with tears and wobbles, and I tried feebly to get my hand loose from hers. I couldn't understand what was happening. I couldn't understand why no one was stopping this from happening. These were my friends and neighbors. They knew me. I looked back and saw the blurry masses as they left the market in a crowd, taking their purchases with them. In a way, I suppose that's what this woman was doing. She was taking what she wanted with her, but I found myself wondering if I was a knick-knack for her shelf or something tasty for her pantry. I pulled against her as we neared the edge of the parking lot, afraid that she was going to try to get me in her vehicle. Stranger danger wasn't quite as prevalent as it is now, but everyone knew that you didn't take rides from people you didn't know, and you certainly didn't let people take you anywhere you didn't want to go. I pulled and yelled, telling her to let me go, but her fingers were like an iron band around my wrist. She said nothing, but I could see where she was heading, and it made me realize that things were far worse than I had thought. We weren't going to a beat-up Ford or a sparkly Chrysler. We were going towards the woods where the bad things could live, but the woods were also a place that I knew how to protect myself against. She had my arm extended, pulling me along behind her in that squeaky cart, but my other hand was free to reach up my shirt and find the little sigil that Grandma had made for me. It was similar to the one I had given to Miss Sybil with her candle, but the lines always seemed far angrier on this one. This sigil always said to me, "Stay away, I bite," and it lived up to it. I didn't know exactly what would happen, but I knew that it couldn't be any worse than what would happen if I did nothing. When I pressed it against her hand, the leather thong it was on barely touching, she howled like an animal and snatched her hand away from mine. I fell then, sprawling on my backside for a second time that day, as I held the sigil out towards her like a warning. She looked down at the symbol, and I heard her hiss as she backed into her own cart. You hurt me," she shouted, looking down at her burnt hand. She seemed surprised, like this had never happened to her. "Get away from me! Leave me alone!" I said. The two of us stood for a moment, like a pair of gunslingers before the draw. Then, silently, she slithered back into the woods, the canopy concealing her as she disappeared. I sat there for a few more seconds, my necklace held out before me. Then I stood up, walked towards the market, backpedaling as I kept my eyes on the trees. Grandma found me as I made my way back, and one look was enough to tell her that something had happened. I tried to explain it to her, to describe the lady, but she shushed me as people began to look down at us with concern. She had packed our things in the truck and had come to look for me when I still hadn't shown up. Any idea of stopping at the stalls to look at toys had fled me. All I wanted was to leave, to go home, to be as far from this place as possible. On the way home, Grandma told me about who, or what, I had stumbled across. She's called Soap Sally, and I haven't seen her in decades. She comes looking for children, usually older children, and drags them to her den. There she kills them and makes soap from their bodies. She leaves the soap for their families, delighting in the idea that they might use it to wash their hands or their bodies. She's a hateful, spiteful old spirit, but unfortunately, she's quite powerful. I had hoped never to see her again in this region, but it appears I may have to slap her nose again. Grandma was gone for a few days after that, but when she returned, she told me that I wouldn't have to worry about that one again. I never saw that old hag ever again, but sometimes, when I smell floral soap or certain kinds of potpourri, I remember that day at the market and remember how weak and helpless I felt in the clutches of that one. It's not a memory I like to dwell on. The two of us sat behind our table, the crowd bustling around us as we both shivered in unison. "That sigil you were talking about," I asked. "Can you show me how to make one?" Grandpa grinned. "I'll make it our next lesson, kid." I had learned a little something about Grandpa's ways since his last story, but learning how to protect myself against the darker things in the forest sounded like something useful to know. When I was 8, I was abducted for about an hour. I know that's an odd statement, but trust me when I say, it gets weirder. When I was 8, a man abducted me right off the street. My parents and I lived in a shabby apartment about a block from my primary school. Since Mom worked days and Dad worked nights, I was responsible for getting myself to and from school since I was 6. I walked the same way home every day, and if someone was trying to snatch me, it wouldn't have been hard to learn my routine. So there I was, walking to school with my Power Rangers book bag swinging off my shoulder, thinking of nothing more pressing than the math test I hadn't studied for the night before. Suddenly, a white van rolled close enough to ruffle my hair with the side mirror of the van. Then a hand caught the handle at the top of my book bag and pulled me in. I struggled as the meaty hand lifted me into the passenger seat, but he pulled me up with little effort. He reached over and shut the door, his arm crossing right in front of my face. This would have been my opportunity to bite or kick or fight in some way before the van rolled on again. I found myself unable to react though, frozen by the ease at which I had been lifted from the street. As we moved away from the curb, I glanced at my abductor as he sat behind the wheel. It's funny how your mind always creates a picture of a potential abductor. When the teacher talks about the strangers in school, I always picture a man in a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat that covers his face, a soft voice with a gentle nature. On all the TV shows I wasn't allowed to watch but did, child molesters were always these casual business types with vans full of candy and sweet smiles. This guy, however, looked nothing like the guys on TV. The man sitting next to me was large, gray, and scary looking. He looked more like the prisoners on the TV shows I watched when no one was paying attention. He had long, greasy hair that was graying in odd places, muscular arms connected to a barrel chest barely contained by his dirty sweater, and a pair of eyes that looked 1,000 miles away as he piloted the van on its course. I became terrified that I would never see my parents again, that I would never see my toys again, and that my parents wouldn't have anything to remember me by except the school picture I'd brought home last week. It's funny sometimes, the things kids worry about. "Don't worry, Mark. I'm not gonna hurt you," the guy said in a gravelly voice full of mucus. I stiffened in my seat. How do you know my name?" That was a stupid question. The man had probably been stalking me for weeks before making his move. He knew my name, he knew my parents' names, he knew my address, he knew the kids I played with at recess, and what time I took my first poop every morning. He had stalked me like a hunter stalks a deer, and now it was time to move in for the kill. Because I am you. That took me by surprise. I had expected many things. I had thought maybe he'd say he was in love with me, to scream at me that he would kill me so I'd be scared so he could get off on my fear, maybe even that he would keep me forever, that he'd be my new dad, or I'd be his new son. I hadn't expected him to say that he was me. What do you mean? I asked, visibly confused. He stared straight ahead, seemingly unable to begin. I thought again about how he was probably going to hurt me and leave me in the woods somewhere after he'd killed me. That was what the killers always did on unsolved mysteries after they killed someone. I bet he had a shovel or something in the back. My 8-year-old mind could already see him carrying my limp body off into the forest to bury me in an unmarked grave. The dogs would come sniffing after me at some point, and they'd unearth a perfect little skeleton in a hole in the woods. My parents would cry and scream, just like the parents did on TV, and Robert Stack would ask the viewers to call if they had any information. It's funny, the places a kid's mind goes when he's in panic. This is hard, kid. Now that I'm here, I don't know how to start. We sat in silence for a few more minutes before he found his words. So, in 40 years, humanity cracks the secret to time travel. He paused again, unsure how to continue, before finally settling into a rhythm. By the time they do, you will have spent 20 years of your mandatory 2 life sentences in prison. I turned to look at him, unable to comprehend what he was saying. Prison? Why am I in prison? He sighed, fishing a cigarette out of the cup holder, where he had several sitting loose. He pressed the lighter on the dashboard and put the cigarette in his mouth as he waited for it to pop again. We've done some things we aren't proud of, Mark. We acted in haste, and now we have to contemplate at leisure. Let's just say that you took the easy way out one too many times, and finally, it came back to bite you. The old neighborhood claims us all eventually, Mark. You're living in a septic tank, and it's only a matter of time before you get pulled down into the shit. The lighter popped, making me jump, and he yanked it out and pressed the tip to the cigarette. He inhaled and turned back to look at me. We don't have much time. Someone noticed me take you off the street. At least they did last time. And the cops are going to pull me over in about 10 minutes. You have to stop this from happening. You can't let the old neighborhood claim you like it always does. There are bad people there. People that will be responsible for your downfall. You have to get as far away from them as you can. You have to get away and never look back. If you stay, you'll be forever damned. Get out, Mark. Get out and live. The cigarette jittered in his lips. He was shaking me then, yelling into my face, shaking me as the cigarette's red end swam back and forth in his mouth. I felt my head getting fuzzy as he shook me, and when the red light started flashing, I thought it might be from all the shaking. He stopped then, turning to look back at the lights, and reached into his pocket to pull out a gleaming piece of steel. It was a gun, a big gun, and when he stepped out of the car and leveled it at the policeman, they seemed afraid. They weren't afraid when they shot him, though. They yelled at me when I climbed out of the driver's door, but I didn't care. I held his hand as he lay dying, his face turning to look at me. I could see that half his cheek was missing. His sweater was turning the color of autumn leaves, and when he spoke, it was gurgly and wet. He coughed a bright spray of blood onto my shirt, and I still remember how it stood out against the bright yellow as the cops came running towards me. Get out, Mark. Get out before it's too... By the time they got there, he was dead. My parents arrived shortly after I got to the police station. Mom hugged me, crying, and Dad wrapped himself clumsily around me as well. It was the first time in months that I could remember seeing them together. As they folded me into their embrace, I remember thinking that everything was going to be okay. I could avoid the scary man's prophecy and prevent the terrible fate that he was trying to warn me about. How naive I was then. That night, Mom and Dad had a terrible fight. Mom wanted to leave the neighborhood. She wanted us to stay with Grandma and Grandpa for a while, until we could find a different place. She didn't feel safe here, not in a place where people just got picked up off the street and nearly kidnapped in broad daylight. Dad wouldn't hear of it. He had lived here his whole life. This was where his work was. She was crazy. Maybe she could just get another job somewhere, but he wasn't about to throw away 10 years on the job because she was scared. As I lay in bed, I realized that everything wasn't just going to be okay. I clutched my stuffed Ninja Turtle tightly as they continued to rage at each other in the living room. The next day, Mom came to talk to me. It was decided that Mom and I would stay with my grandparents for a while. It was also decided that Dad would stay at the apartment. A little while turned into the next 10 years of my life. My parents got divorced a year after we went to stay with Grandma and Grandpa. I went to see him a few times, but Mom usually insisted that he come to us. When I did go to see him, she came with me. She still didn't trust the old neighborhood, and the few times I went back, I saw that it had gotten worse. Gangs and drugs had taken over, and Dad had become a stranger to me. When the construction company he had been with for so long closed down, he joined the element around him. Mom wouldn't tell me what he was doing, but I'm sure he was making drugs. The next time I saw him, he looked like a zombie from a horror movie. His hair was thinning, his face was gaunt, and he smelled like a truck stop toilet. He told me to stay in school and make something of myself. He told me not to end up like him, not to let people I thought were my friends drag me down into something I couldn't get back out of. Whether he knew it or not, he spoke the words that the strange man had said to me when he told me to never come back to our old neighborhood. "It's a trap, son. The only thing it can do is ruin you." When his apartment burned down a few months later, Mom didn't even take me to his funeral. I was 15 by then, just starting high school, and ready for the rest of my life. My grandparents had money, the kind of money that I now understand my mom wanted. They gave both of us the best life they could. With my grandfather's influence, I got into private school after private school. My mother made it very clear that I wasn't to squander the gifts I'd been given, and I took her at her word. By the time I was 18, I was at the top of my class and ready to enter almost any college I wanted. College was where I met Tabitha, though. Tabitha was where everything changed. I enrolled in a prestigious college, but I won't sully their reputation by naming them here. They were proud to name me amongst their alumni when I first stepped into their halls of learning. I took to my classes much the way I had taken to high school classes. I excelled, was noticed, and was praised for my hard work. I made the dean's list and was invited to join the kinds of academic circles that would ensure I had my own level of influence when the time came for my children to attend school. I was as far from that sidewalk in my old neighborhood as I had ever been. Little did I know, I was much closer than I thought. Tabitha was a year above me. She was a film major I'd met through a friend, and I knew I wanted her from the first time I saw her. My friend Jace was not what you would call centered on his studies. Jace had been accepted on a sports scholarship, and I had accepted that he was a burnout who was here to party and meet girls. Jace thought it was the height of hilarity to get me to skip out on my studies and hang out with him and his other friends, and Tabitha was one such friend. It was she who brought me about to the return of my old life. It all started because Jace was in my room, calling the person he bought drugs from. "Damn it!" he yelled, slamming the phone down and startling me from my work. "He won't sell me anymore," he sulked, drawing his feet to his chest as he sat on my bed. "Says my friends keep calling and coming by, and he thinks we're bringing heat around. Where am I supposed to get my Aether now?" Aether was a drug that was trendy on campus at the time. I knew it was amphetamine-based, but other than that, I had little knowledge of it. I didn't take drugs. I wanted to stay sharp, and other than the knowledge I gained from Jace and his friends, I was pretty ignorant of the whole culture. I was supposed to get some for the party tonight. Now I gotta show up empty-handed. A party, I thought. Maybe Tabitha would be there. I wanted to see her again, but if Jace wasn't invited to any more parties, neither would I. I thought fast and realized that I might not be as ignorant about the culture as I thought. Maybe I did know someone. I know a place you could get some drugs, I said, almost shyly. An hour later, we pulled up in front of my Uncle Randy's house. Uncle Randy was what I had always called Dad's friend Randall for most of my life. He and Dad had been childhood friends. Uncle Randy had been the best man at my parents' wedding, and I kept in touch with him a little after Dad died. His house had once been pretty, too pretty for a bachelor, Mom would often say, but now it looked run down and kind of creepy when we pulled up. Jace looked at me as if to say this was not how he was used to buying drugs, but I climbed out and told him to follow me. Randy was on the front porch, and he looked rough. He had clearly been cooking for quite some time. Burn scars and adult acne spotted his face. His receding hairline had been scooped back until the shiny pate drew attention to the greasy ponytail that hung limply off the back of his head. He looked like every internet troll you'd ever seen memed, but his weaselly eyes were full of dull hate, and a bright hunger for whatever he could get from others. He greeted me warmly, but his eyes never smiled. We bought Aether from him, and were gone without much catching up or small talk. Apparently Uncle Randy did not have time for small talk anymore. The party was a huge success. Tabitha was there, and after Jace told them all how I had saved the party, she warmed up to me considerably. I didn't need the Aether that she puffed into my mouth with every passionate kiss. I was high enough off just being that close to her. She spent most of the party with her hand wrapped around mine, her body pressed against me. We were dating after that. I wouldn't use Aether. Just getting a contact high when we kissed was enough for me. She called it Aether hopping, and delighted in pushing the potent smoke into my mouth with every kiss. We started becoming very close. As we spent more and more time together, I tried to juggle my studies with the rush of my new girlfriend. I had always been too consumed by my term papers, or the collegiate essay, to have much time for a companion. With Tabitha, though, I felt happy in her distraction and full of her presence. Eventually, we graduated from college and moved into our own apartment. She got work as a columnist for a magazine, and I started work as an architect for a firm in the city. The money was good, we were both making enough to do the things we loved, and we found ample time to spend with each other. Tabitha kept her drug use under control, and I had broken myself of what little habit I had. Tabitha was enough for me, and I hoped I was enough for her. I was so naive. We'd been together about a year when she started spiraling. She said that she wrote better when she was on Aether. She certainly wrote more, but probably not better. The magazine she wrote for began to kick the articles back, not pleased with her work. This made her more self-conscious and made her use more. As the money stopped coming in, she still seemed to find ways to get Aether. She never asked me for money, and I could always tell when she was just going day to day, trying to find her fix. In hindsight, I should have realized what was going on. She began to be gone for long periods of time, always coming home tired and irritable. She was aloof and confrontational. When I confronted her about it, she became aggressive and often combative. I never knew what to do in these cases. She was so removed from the Tabitha I had fallen in love with, and I didn't know what to do with her when she became this venom-spitting demon. Afterwards, we always made up. She said how sorry she was, and promised she'd never do it again. Then we repeated the experience a few weeks later. The night she came home with bruises was really when I lost it. We fought, a screaming match like none we'd ever had, and she stormed out of the apartment. I heard her car start up and leave the lot. I just sat in our apartment, wondering what I should do. What I did in the end was follow her. I had often worried that her drug use might send her spiraling out of control, so I had installed a program on her phone that would let me track its location. I know this sounds invasive, but I was terrified that she might get lost or hurt, and I might need to find her quickly. Aether has some severe health risks, and the thought of her having a heart attack or something and no one being able to find her hurt me deeply. I wish, now that I had just let her leave. I followed her to the neighborhood. I followed her to Uncle Randy's house. Her car was parked outside. As I walked up, I could already hear a low noise coming from the living room. The lights were off, the living room curtains were drawn, but they were illuminated from behind by the glow of the TV. The door was ajar, one of her purple sneakers left across the threshold. As I pushed the door open, I could hear Tabitha's heady moans and could guess what was going on. Randall was her supplier. When she couldn't pay him, she had settled up in other ways. Now she was in his living room, paying with the only currency she had left. I'd like to say that I flew into a rage, but I didn't. I'd like to say that I blacked out, but I didn't. I remember everything with crystal clarity. I opened the coat closet and took out the shotgun I knew that he had there from childhood. It was loaded, as it always was, and Uncle Randy had kept it as clean and oiled as the day he had shown it to 7-year-old me. He told me it was for bad people that might want to hurt him. He told me it wasn't a toy, and I should never point a gun at anyone I didn't want dead. A lesson that came back to bite him that day. Tabitha screamed when she saw me framed in the living room door. She had been smiling a moment before, but now all the blood had drained from her face. She looked like the corpse she would soon become. Randy turned his head, that greasy tail swinging. He looked at me in surprise, and I leveled the shotgun at the two of them, my face a cold mask of indifference. Tabitha said my name, mouthed it before her perfect chest was a spray of blood, and the buckshot turned it into a pitted landscape of gore and viscera. Randy said nothing. The first shot had opened up the top of his skull, and he died instantly. She lay atop him, tears welling in her eyes as she fought for breath. She fixed me with those eyes as if to say, well, what else was I supposed to do? I didn't have an answer for her. I just dropped the gun on the worn rug and walked out onto the front porch to wait for the cops. I wasn't there when she died. I didn't hold her in my arms and tell her how sorry I was. I just sat on the porch and listened to her gasp out her breaths until they were muffled by the sound of approaching police sirens. I was convicted of a double homicide at the age of 22. I was given 2 life sentences, and I will never see the outside world again. Except, I guess I will. I don't know how old I'll be when the program makes me an offer. The self I met was old, but everyone over 20 is old to an 8-year-old. If I had to guess, I would say he was somewhere in his 40s, but that's just a guess. He told me I would be in prison for 20 years. I guess this is a fact that's set in stone. As I sit in my cell and think about my future, I often think about what he said. Someone saw me take you off the street. At least they did last time. That leads me to believe that he experienced this when he was a child. Maybe I always go back and try to warn myself, and perhaps I always fail. What if my life is nothing but a loop of trying and dying to keep myself from coming to Randy's living room and ruining my life? How long has this loop been going on? What would happen if I closed it? Would I simply cease to exist? I lay on my single bed some nights, staring at the roaches crawling across the ceiling, and think about the people who have brought me to this point. My mother, my father, my grandparents, Jace, Tabitha, Uncle Randy, and I somehow know what must be done as they all swim by. When it's my turn to step into the past, I don't think I'll explain anything. I might just take the gun out of my pocket and shoot myself as I sit rooted in the passenger seat and see what happens next. I've got 20 years to think about it, I guess. Plenty of time to work out the finer points of my own murder. Mr. Claude T. Griggs smiled as he saw the frantic man coming shakily towards him from across the bar. He had expected this. He had sold him exactly what he'd asked for, but not necessarily what he'd wanted. It served him right, though, Claudius thought, as he took another sip from his drink. The man, this Mr. Seraph, had clearly been tricking people for a long time. It was time he had a taste. Mr. Seraph slammed his hands down on the table, and the heads that turned quickly looked away again. This was none of their concern, and they didn't want to get involved with this wild and unstable fellow. "What did you do?" he whispered harshly. "What in the hell did you do?" "Sold you my talent. It was what you wanted, wasn't it?" Claudius asked, taking another leisurely sip from his glass. He tried to keep the smile from his face as he said it, but he failed miserably. It was just too funny, after all. Libris Talent had contacted him in the usual way. They had seen some of his work online, a burgeoning crime novel about a serial killer and his murder spree, and though it was coming along nicely, it was really more of a hobby. Claudius had things he was passionate about, a career he was striving to advance in, and writing was just a hobby at the end of the day. He wanted to eventually finish it, but it seemed that Libris Talent and the ever-smiling Mr. Seraph didn't want to wait anymore. The email had offered him compensation for his talent. The sum was fair, and Claudius was tempted to take this Mr. Seraph up on his generous offer. Claudius was no fool, though. He knew enough to do research, and the research was what made him curious about this Mr. Seraph and his Libris Talent. A quick Google search showed him many positive reviews for the company, many squibs about philanthropy and charity, but very little about what the company actually did. Sure, they were generous, but what did they produce with that talent? Claudius saw no books, no magazines, nothing but a simple website that proclaimed them as a talent agency, always with the word in capital. Talent. At the end of the day, that seemed to be what they peddled, and business seemed pretty good. Good enough to travel from town to town and find people willing to sell their talent, only to disappear in the night again once the business was done. He learned this little fact on a small subreddit, and that was also where he had met a stranger who had information that turned out to be very important. He called himself fallen_Libris, and he had a good many things to say about Libris' talent and Mr. Seraph. He claimed that the man had bought his talent, and when he had lost the ability to write. It had taken him months to be able to write more than a simple email. His story, his ideas, his talent, they had all been sold to someone else. That someone had used them to expand his small fortune and left fallen_Libris with a small check and a sense of emptiness that no money could take away. That had given Claudius an idea he had set into motion with his return email. He had arrived at Libris' talent to be greeted by a stark waiting room and a smiling woman whose eyes were just a little too bright as she told him to go ahead to the back. "Mr. Seraph is waiting for you, Mr. Griggs." Claudius had smiled at that. He doubted they were expecting the talent he was bringing. Mr. Seraph was at his desk when Claudius arrived. His smile was wide and bright enough to fall into. Claudius was honestly surprised that his head didn't simply separate in the middle and slide off. On his stark desk sat a fountain pen in a holder and an old-looking book. Claudius thought this was really what he was here to see. Not this grinning corpse or this fancy pen, but this silently breathing book that sat closed before him. "Mr. Griggs," Mr. Seraph said, his predatory eyes following him as he took a seat, "I am so glad that you decided to take us up on our generous offer." That was the moment that he realized he might be in over his head. He was a fox that had suddenly realized how big the bear was, and that he might not be as clever as he thought. For better or worse, he was in the trap now. He could only win or lose from here, and he was intent on not being another victim of this smiling man. "I assume you have looked over our terms?" Mr. Seraph asked, those eyes still intent on him. "Sounds a little too good to be true," Claudius had said, feigning disbelief. "Well, that's the benefit of working with a company like ours," Mr. Seraph said silkily. Claudius asked him what he wanted, what he meant by talent exactly, and Mr. Seraph assured him that it was all quite common. "We buy the talents of those who may or may not be utilizing them to their fullest. Your writing shows great promise, but it's clear that it isn't something you value. Sell us your talent, and we will compensate you for it. It's as simple as that." Claudius shrugged and asked how they would proceed. Mr. Seraph opened that hungry book and handed him the pen from the little holder. "What do I do?" Claudius asked, still not quite sure how this worked. "Just let your hands do their work," Mr. Seraph said. From the time the pen touched the paper, Claudius was writing. The ink was red, blood red, and Claudius filled the page with the darkness that swelled within him. Every grisly murder, every bloody scene, every pain-filled cry, every feeling of dread was perfectly conveyed with gruesome clarity. He wrote until his hand burned, until his fingers cramped, and as his shoulder went numb, he just kept his focus on that wide shark's grin his adversary wore. As the ink began to spill from the book in torrents, the sea of blood rising, Claudius felt his vision begin to blur. As his legs became wet with the effort of his hands, he let his look of exquisite rapture match that of Mr. Seraph's. When he awoke in his bed, a check on the nightstand, and a feeling of relief within him, he sighed in contentment. It was over for Claudius, but it was only beginning for Mr. Seraph. And now here he was, this ancient engine of destruction, looking for answers to a question that had only just arisen. He wanted to know why 3 writers who had, Claudius assumed, bought his talent, had murdered their families. He wanted to know why one of the most prolific crime writers of the age had decided to kill his wife, his kids, and his grandkids as they visited him for the weekend. Mr. Seraph was angry, he was embarrassed, and now he wanted answers. Claudius supposed he owed him that much. "Sit," Claudius said, smiling again as he saw the irony. Mr. Seraph sat, a vein throbbing in his temple. "You see, when you bought my talent, you believed all you were buying was my writing talent. My writing talent is okay, but my true talents lay in darker places than you could even have guessed. I write what I know, Mr. Seraph, and what I know is murder. Every one of my crimes is something I had written about in my short stories. Every cut, every gasp, every spray of blood was something I had created. As he spoke, Mr. Seraph's eyes grew wider and more concerned. It was all great fun, but it couldn't go on forever. The older you get, Mr. Seraph, the harder it is to maintain that level of brutality. Despite knowing better, murder is often like a mania. You can't stop it. You can only appease it for a time. So, I gave it to you, Claudius said, grinning like a fool. Mr. Seraph was speechless. Have you any idea what you've done? Claudius sipped at his drink and fixed him with a decidedly toothy grin. Beaten you at your own game, and gotten myself a reprieve from something that would have likely landed me in a prison cell. A real win-win for me. For just a moment, Claudius saw what lay beneath the surface. A flash, the barest glimpse, but it was enough to let him see the blistery old devil who lay beneath the flesh mask. Mr. Seraph had lost his cool for a fraction of a second, and Claudius realized he had won a victory over more than just a dusty old warlock or a talented spook. He had beaten a creature who had been young when his grandsire was first pulling itself out of the primordial ooze. Well played, Mr. Griggs, Mr. Seraph said, rising to leave. I'm sure this won't be our last encounter. As he left, Claudius drank his beer in triumph. He certainly hoped it wouldn't be. They tell you not to get too friendly with the inmates. Statistically, 45% of prison staff will have an unwise encounter with an inmate at some point in their career. What this translates to varies from person to person, but in my case, it was a little worse than most. I lost it all, and all because I talked a little too much with an inmate. "Morning, Sarge." That was inmate Howard's usual greeting. He'd been in maximum security for as long as I could remember. He'd been sentenced to life in prison for a string of murders he'd committed against women. He'd gotten himself a cell in maximum security because he'd killed at least 3 roommates. Now he was housed alone, got his meals in a styrofoam tray, and only got rec once a week, and only then under the closest of scrutiny. If ever oh ever there was a bad guy in prison, it was inmate Howard. That being said, I'd never had any trouble out of him. He was always polite. He never sat at the door and ogled nurses when they came to pass meds. He never kicked the door or threw his shit, and was generally well behaved as far as inmates go. He read a lot, never really talked to anyone, and mostly kept to himself. He didn't even really speak to the other COs, except for me. I was the only one that had more to say to him than shut up. His conversations started off light. He was a football fan, and he wanted to know how his team was doing as I passed mail. What sort of movies were in theaters while I handed out lunch? How was I, or how was the health of my family while I pushed around the laundry cart? Standard stuff, conversation starters. Pretty typical of inmates locked in a cell for 23 hours a day. I kept my responses casual at first, 1 or 2 word answers, but after a while, you start getting used to people. Inmates are criminals, they're bad guys, but you see them as often as you see your friends after a while. I was never friends with them. That's never a good idea. You do become relaxed after a while, though. You let your guard down. You start to discuss last night's football game with them. You talk about how the new Judge Dredd movies are so much better than the old ones. You ask them about their families, and you tell them a little bit about yours. You start to look at them like animals in a zoo. The animals are behind bars, and thus no threat to you. You get relaxed. You get comfortable looking and stepping a little closer to the bars than you usually would. You forget that the animals still have claws and horns and teeth. You forget that the animals are still animals. I was sitting at his cell one afternoon, sorting mail and passing a word, when he suddenly told me something that made me look up from my mail sack. I'd gotten comfortable enough talking with him and made a habit of it almost every afternoon. I never spent long out there, just a few minutes of conversation, and we usually talked about the sort of thing he could learn about if he took the time. We had just finished talking about the Cowboys, a team we both liked, and their miserable loss last weekend, when he suddenly asked me if I believed in God. I rolled my eyes, expecting a jailhouse sermon, My God, Howard, don't tell me how you found Jesus in this hellish place. Nope, not sure he even exists. Don't see how he could if he'd give a man like me this condition. Condition? Your condition came from murdering all those women. I don't think Jesus had much to do with that, Howard. No, not that condition, he paused, looking around conspiratorially. Sarge, if I tell you something, will you promise not to tell anyone else? I perked my ears up. It wasn't uncommon to get a cell-side confession from some of these guys. They were hard to a point, but eventually their crimes began to weigh on them at night. So they tell some officer their sins so he can go tell the captain, and he can tell the warden so he can tell the families of the victims, and the victims can get some closure. I didn't know if that's what this was, but I was curious nonetheless. Sure, I promise. He leaned against the glass and whispered into the little ventilator grate. I can't die. I laughed. I couldn't help it. Yeah, good thing they gave you life then. Not being able to die would put a real damper on a death sentence. He looked at me through the glass, and I could tell that he was absolutely serious. I gave him a stern look. There is no way. Get the hell out of here. No one is immune to death, Howard. Howard stepped back into his cell and seemed to ignore me. He sat on his bunk and stared at the floor, and I kept passing mail. There was no way. This was a classic inmate game of see if I can get one over on the CO. Once I bought it, he'd laugh and tell the quad how he'd got me, and they'd all laugh at me too. When I finished his quad, I looked back at his cell, and he was standing at the door again. Howard was wearing the same determined look that I'd seen earlier, and for a moment, I wanted to talk to him and clear things up. If he hurt himself because of this, I could get into some real trouble. I put it out of my mind, though, and went about my routine. It was almost time to leave, and I wanted to be out of the door when 6 o'clock rolled around. Howard didn't bring it up again until the next day. I came around with the lunch trays and noticed that he was standing in the back of his cell. He was naked from the waist up, his chest a tapestry of scars and mostly healed burns, and he was pressing a shank to the spot where his heart should be. I scrambled for my keys as I fumbled for my gas, intending to spray him before he could stab himself. Before I could get the flap open, he had already plunged the knife in. He backed into the wall, his knees giving way as his blood pumped out of his chest. I felt my numb fingers reaching for my radio to call for help. I had just drawn it to my mouth when he hit the door, the hole in his chest already closing, and drug the wet knife across the glass. "Believe me now?" he said, his voice completely even. The radio buzzed to life. Whoever was in the booth must have noticed me hit the door and thought something was going on. I keyed up the radio and told him that everything was okay as I watched the knife slide out from under the cell door and bump my foot. Howard stepped back, hands raised, a big grin on his face like a magician at the end of a particularly good trick. I still insisted that he go to medical. I told them that he had told me about a bad nosebleed, and when the captain saw how much blood was in his cell, he agreed. We shackled him, cuffed him, and took him down the path to medical, his chest and pants awash with blood. I agreed to sit with him in medical, and after the nurse looked him over, we sat in the exam room and waited to be released. That was where he told me the whole story. When I was 6, Dad came home drunk and broke my neck during a beating. I thought I was dead, lying on the floor while Mom screamed between punches, waiting to float off to wherever came next. When I didn't die, I realized that my neck wasn't broken. It had been. I knew it had been, but it wasn't anymore. My mother cried over me, tears streaming out of her raccoon eyes, and that was when I realized that I was different. When I was 16, a cop shot me 3 times in the chest during a robbery. I spent 3 years in juvie, but I was also deemed a medical miracle. I've been stabbed, burned, shot, thrown out of and off of things, and I always come back just fine. I listened to his story, unsure I would believe it if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. That's why I wanted to tell you about it, Sarge. When my dad broke my neck, it was 1901. Dad was a coal miner, Mom was a homemaker, and I've seen the rise and fall of a century. I've looked 30 since I was 20, and I'll go right on looking 30 forever if I choose to. The thing is, I'm tired of living. It's a curse to live this long, especially here, and I want to die. There's only one way I can do it, though. He leaned in close, his chains clinking as they kept him strapped to the bed. I have to give this power to someone. I leaned away from him, his breath reeking of unbrushed teeth. And you want to give it to me? I said dubiously. You're always one of the good ones, Sarge. You treat us fairly, like people, and that means something to us. I want you to have this curse. Maybe you can do more with it than I could. I'd be a liar if I said the idea of living forever didn't appeal to me. Having unlimited time to pursue the things I loved, not having to worry about time getting away from me, being able to enjoy life until I was ready for it to end. The word curse kept rattling around in my brain, but I honestly was having trouble seeing it as a curse. As I lay next to my wife that night, I imagined outliving her and our son. Maybe that was the curse. Maybe Howard had watched the people he loved die over the years. Maybe that was the terrible part. I mulled it over for a week before I finally gave him my answer. We were taking them out for cell cleanup, and as Howard stood there, ankles chained and hands cuffed behind his back, I moved next to him to ask my question. So, say I wanted to take this power. How do we do it? He smiled, knowingly. I've been thinking about it for a while, huh? Well, yeah, you have to admit it's a tempting offer. He nodded, but said nothing. So how does it work? I asked impatiently. We shake hands, and you say, I take this burden unto myself. That's it? I asked incredulously. That's it, he said. He turned to look at me then, and the look in his eyes should have told me all I needed to know. His face was calm, but his eyes were hungry to be rid of this curse. His eyes burned with a secret desire, a desire unknown to anyone who hadn't been trapped in a cage like he had. His whole body seemed to vibrate as he extended his hand. If I hadn't been so eager, no, greedy is a better word. If I hadn't been so greedy, I would have seen the look and never come close enough to touch him again. Instead, I reached out and shook his hand without a second thought, saying the words exactly as he had said them. I take this burden unto myself. That is when the most intense feeling of vertigo I had ever felt hit me. My vision doubled, tripled, swam like a pool of turbulent water. For a minute that was locked in eternity, I could feel my very being as it was siphoned from me and spat back by a giant lung. I was turned into a tornado, bottled in a jar, and poured over a volcano. I cannot adequately describe what happened, but when I returned to myself, everything had changed. I was slumped against the railing, head spinning, and vomit dripping between the grating of the catwalk. My hands hurt, and my legs seemed sluggish. I could hear voices asking if I was okay, but my tongue didn't want to work properly when I tried to respond. As my vision cleared, I was again struck by an odd sense of vertigo as I saw myself coming up from my knees. I stood up and shook my head, testing my hands and looking over at myself as I leaned against the rail. I tried to reach out, but my hands were stuck behind me. I took a step towards myself, but my legs came up short, and I fell on my face on the metal grating. My nose broke, and I was aware of the second most excruciating pain in my life. I rolled over, spitting blood, and I could see myself standing over me. When I smiled, I felt cold horror spreading over me. Howard's smile was spreading across my face. What happened? One of the COs asked, coming out of the cell and looking at Howard as he stood over me. This inmate lunged at me. I had to put him down before he hurt himself, Howard said, never taking his eyes off me. That's so, the CO said. I think his name was Taylor, but who remembers? Want me to call the captain down here so we can start some paperwork? Nah, I think he's had enough. Help me get him back in the cell, Howard said. They moved me back into Howard's cell, grabbing me under the arms. Once the leg restraints came off, they walked out and closed the door. I struggled to my feet and ran to the little window, but Howard was already leaving the quad. Officer Taylor told me to put my hands through the flap so he could get the cuffs off. I tried to explain to him, tried to tell him how I was not inmate Howard, how inmate Howard had put my mind in his body, but the things I was saying were a hard sale at best. Taylor stared at me through the glass, blankly listening to what I was saying in the same way I had listened to 1,000 other inmates. He heard my words, crazy as they sounded, but he let them wash over him before he again told me to give up the cuffs before he had to call the captain down here. I put my hands out, and he took them off. I tried to tell him what had happened again, but he closed the flap and moved on, leaving me in an 8x10 cell with nothing but my own confused emotions. That first night was the worst night of my life. I paced the cell, eating and drinking nothing, as my mind ran around my head like a trapped rat. I hadn't seen Howard for the rest of the day, and it didn't do any good to try to talk to any of the other officers. They just thought I was talking crazy talk to get sent to psych, or ignored me as I raged against the glass. I didn't sleep that night. After lights out, I walked and screamed and yelled my frustration out amongst the other prisoners that screamed for me to shut the hell up. If you've never been inside one of those cells with the door closed, you can't imagine how small it feels. Knowing that you have no escape from that hell is pure madness. Knowing that no one will come if something should happen to you is pure hell. I understand after that night why so many inmates go insane. I worried about my wife and son the most. What if Howard found his way to my house? Wearing my face, my wife would greet him, let him in without question. What would he do to them? Would he hurt them? Thinking like that made me scream all over again, and by morning, I feared my vocal cords had been damaged. The juice they gave me with breakfast helped my raw throat, but did little for my mental anguish. After the first night, I found a numb little hole in my mind to crawl into. That was where I lived for the next few weeks. If someone came to give me food, I ate it. If someone came to take me to the shower, I went. If they tried to take me to rec, I ignored them. I slept in a fetal ball on my mat and just let time slip by. Time had ceased to matter anymore. Sometimes I would sleep the whole day, lost in my misery and coldness. The world shrank to an 8x10 concrete box, and the things outside mattered very little. I could hear whispers on the quad, but I ignored them. My name came up often, my old name, that Howard now wore. No one had seen him in a while, and there was talk that something had happened. I had done something bad, and was likely not coming back. I tried to block it out. I held my hands against my ears and refused to listen. But as the details came out, my worst fears were realized. I had murdered my family. I had shot and killed my wife and son. There was evidence of sexual assault on my wife. Neighbors had heard her begging for her life, heard my son screaming as I killed them. He had left afterwards and killed 5 more people. They had caught him in the act and taken him alive. His trial was scheduled for later this month. He was likely to get the death penalty. This information trickled in over the course of weeks. I was privy to it, but did not actively participate. I stopped eating, my eyes constantly running at the thought of my family's suffering. My wife, my son, they were both lost forever. They had died believing that I was their killer. My greed had led to their deaths. As I lay there, I realized I couldn't take the pain. I tried to kill myself the next night. The officer on duty found me hanging from a bed sheet and cut me down, rushing me to medical. It was needless. I had suffered no ill effect. I had never even lost consciousness. Howard had been right. My body refused to die. I could have cut myself, stabbed myself, thrown myself off the bunk, and never even suffered a bit of ill. I had gained the power I wanted, and now I saw it for the curse it was. I spent a week under medical observation, sitting in a 12x12 concrete room with a big glass window that they could monitor me through. I was dressed in an oversized green smock with Velcro fastenings and given a rip-resistant mattress to sleep on. They gave me pills for the pain, pills for the psychosis, pills for the depression I was likely suffering from, but I didn't take them. I spit them out the second they weren't looking and wallowed in my pain. After a week, they let me go back to my old cell. When I got back, I heard someone calling my name from the nearby window of J-Dorm, Stragview's death house. I bristled when I heard it, the voice as familiar as my own name. I went to the window and looked out across the short expanse. The cell, as if predestined, faced the wall of the death house. and I could see a grinning face looking through the bars at me. The face was a little ragged, a little haggard, but I would have known it anywhere. I was looking at myself. He spent the rest of his time at the back window, trying to get my attention. I had seen inmates do this when I was an officer, talking to each other through the back window grate, but I lay on the floor and ignored him as he called to me. He tried to goad me, telling me how he'd screwed my wife, how my son had cried when he'd beaten him, how they had both suffered before the end. I just lay there and ignored him. He told me about the gas station he'd turned into an abattoir after that, using my own shotgun to kill 3 customers and a clerk. But I went right on ignoring him. He told me how he'd killed a cop before they'd apprehended him, how the cop had wanted to kill him so badly. Told me how the trial judge had said that life was too good for someone like him. But I went right on ignoring him. I've been sentenced to death. I have no attorney, no appeals to file, no chances for retrial. I doubt I'll last more than a year on death row before they execute me. Looks like I finally get to die. I ignored him. He tried to get my attention at every available moment. He told me of the murders again and again. He told me how his life story had been a lie. He told me how he too had been a guard once, how he had taken the same deal and been trapped for years and years as his sanity eroded away. You'll sit here too. In Stragview, no one seems to care about an eternal prisoner. I ignored him until the day they took him off the block and led him to the chair. I was there on the night they executed him. I did not watch from the window. I lay on the floor of my cell in a fetal ball and did not mourn the passing of my old life. I almost thought I could hear him laugh as the lights dimmed and then they came back up again. I was still there when the sun came up. I was there for a lot more sunrises after that. I don't know how long ago that was. Time had no meaning there. Time had no meaning to those trapped in hell. I ate when I had to. I showered when such was offered. I went to rec when it came my turn. The faces of my wife and son faded from my mind, and for that, I was grateful. Their memories are a fiery brand against my soul, and I know I will be made to answer for them someday. I'm writing this from a library terminal in a city I never bothered to learn the name of. I lived on the streets in much the same way I lived in prison. I eat when food comes my way. I sleep when I can find a safe place to. I shower when such things come to pass. Unlike prison, however, I find myself at rec a lot more often. You must realize by now that if I'm out, someone made the same deal I did. I, however, did look back when I left him in that hell forever. His confusion was familiar, but I never looked back again. I kept running, kept moving, and now I feel my sanity beginning to return. It's easy to forget what hell is like once you're out. So if you work in Stragview and an inmate offers you immortality, do yourself a favor. Tell him to shut the hell up and just keep walking. She was the perfect woman. I have no idea how I managed to catch her attention. Our relationship, our marriage, it was all perfect, except for one thing that neither of us could have foreseen. We met in college. She was working towards her English degree, and I was studying business. My major required me to take an English course, as did hers, and when she asked if the desk next to mine was taken, I was almost too stunned to answer. Kathy was beautiful in that artless way that some women have, and she smiled as I fumbled over my answer. That would have been the end of it for most people. I had fumbled my one chance, but Kathy wasn't like other women. She told me later that she had found it endearing, and she suspected that she was already a little bit taken with me when she sat down. When I saw you from across the room, I just knew that I wanted to get to know you better. We talked a little bit before class, comparing schedules and going over the usual getting-to-know-you chit-chat. When the teacher arrived and class began, I found myself snatching little glances at her as she bent over her notebook. She caught me looking once, and to my surprise, I saw her smile at me. I was smitten after that smile, and when Kathy invited me to have lunch with her after class, I didn't even have to think about it. We were dating a week later, and as we got closer, should have noticed the warning signs of problems to come. I suppose I understand how it escaped my notice, though. Few people would have considered utter peace and pure relaxation a problem. When we walked hand in hand, I would get this feeling of utter peace throughout my body. When we kissed, I felt like nothing in the world could hurt me. She made me feel safe, made my problems melt away, and I knew I wanted more than the few hours a day we got to share with each other. Her college schedule made it difficult to go out more than twice a week, and my own class load kept me busy too. Part of the reason we had such little time together, though, was Kathy's commute to and from school. Kathy lived an hour and a half from campus, and couldn't begin to afford an apartment on her meager student income. The job I worked, plus the leftover grant money I had, paid the rent on my studio apartment, but not much else. Another person paying rent was nice, but I couldn't say that was the only reason that I offered to let her live with me. I also wanted her close to me. She made me feel good, made me feel safe. Being in her presence made the dark world in which I lived more tolerable, and I wanted that for more than a few hours a week. I offered to let her move in, and after a week of mulling it over, she agreed. That weekend, we combined our meager possessions, and I slept like a baby in her arms that night. As we began to spend our evenings together, the problems became more apparent. Problems is a terrible word for it, because in the beginning, it was more like a godsend. When we sat on the couch, our hands linked, I would find myself getting drowsy. When we would cuddle on the couch, our bodies pressed together, I would lose minutes at a time, and my eyes would grow heavier and heavier. The feeling of peace I found in her presence put me at ease, and that ease led to some of the best sleep of my life. I would sleep more deeply than I ever had before, and wake up after 8 hours refreshed and ready to start my day. Kathy seemed pleased with the attention. She'd only been with one other person before we started dating, but I could tell that she wondered why I hadn't slept with her yet. Some women's feelings would have been hurt by this, but Kathy had been raised in a very religious household, and must have assumed that I was simply waiting till marriage. The truth was that, while I would have loved to have slept with her, the sleeping was the problem. Whenever we got close, my arms around her and our bodies pressed together, I would find myself blinking and suddenly losing long periods of time. Sometimes she would lead me to bed, sometimes she would just sleep with me on the couch, but I would always wake up next to Kathy with a deep feeling of fulfillment. I had assumed that she was feeling the same way. I often thought that maybe this was the feeling that we gave each other, and it made me feel good to bring her the same sort of peace that she brought me. This went on for about 6 months, and I thought that things were going well. We went out to dinner, we had friends over, we went on dates, and seemed to be living together with few problems. I had been tentatively looking at rings, preparing to pop the question and make it official. Besides the matter of intercourse, I thought we were happy. Then one evening I came home from class to find her crying on the couch. I hadn't seen her that day. She'd been absent from the one class we had together, and when I'd called her, she said she was feeling sick. It was nothing serious. She maybe had a cold or something. I'd told her to feel better, hanging up so that I could get to my next class. But as I saw her looking up from her cupped hands, I knew something was definitely wrong. I had never seen her cry before, and it was so alarming that I could do little else but go to her and wrap my arms around her. She wouldn't tell me what was wrong, but I wish now that I had pressed her. I wrapped her in my reassuring arms and tried my best to comfort her in her time of need. My reassuring arms quickly turned into drawing her close and wiping her tears away. This soon led to kissing, which led to touching, and then to the bedroom. I won't bore you with the details, but I think you know how it ended up. I woke up the next day, her hands lightly stroking my hair, and fresh tears running down her cheeks. It was our first time, and I couldn't even remember how it had gone. When I asked her to marry me a month later, she seemed overjoyed. We had been living together for half a year now, and our love for one another was pretty clear. She wore my engagement ring with pride, showing it off to her friends, and we began to plan our wedding. I was too blind to see that she was making appointments with a campus therapist more often than she used to. I was too comfortable to notice the tears that sometimes came to her while we lay in bed together. I was too wrapped up in my own feelings to notice the prescriptions that appeared in the medicine cabinet. I was just so comfortable that I never wanted it to end. It's easy to get tunnel vision when you're spending all your time in the tunnel of love, I suppose. After that first time, however, I did make efforts to be better in the bedroom. Kathy was patient with me, seeing that I was trying, but I often found myself trying one moment and waking up the next. She was always quick to reassure me that it was nothing to be ashamed about, but I knew it hurt her deeply to have a partner incapable of being intimate with her. So, I set out to find the reason for my sleeping fits. And so, I began to make doctor's appointments of my own. I said that the appointments were for her benefit, but I was honestly more concerned that I might have a real problem brewing. The last thing I wanted to discover at 22 was that I was a narcoleptic or had a problem with my brain or something. I explained what was happening to my doctor, and he was helpful, if not a little over-jovial. Kids your age shouldn't be having any sort of problems in that department, but we'll get you checked out, he assured me, with a smile and a pat on the shoulder. I was tested for every sleep disorder imaginable. I was given prescriptions of my own, but none of them seemed to work. I took supplements, signed up for new drugs that had just hit the market, and joined medical test groups. Despite all this, though, no one seemed to have any answer for what was going on. I was just so comfortable with my fiancée that I couldn't help but fall asleep in her arms. It would have been sweet if it wasn't worrying me to no end. We had decided on March for our wedding, the first anniversary of our meeting, and I was determined to make it special for her. I was as helpful and dutiful as a boyfriend/fiancé could be. I went with her to every stage of the planning. I picked out cake toppers, helped with seating charts, picked out menus, visited and put down a deposit on the venue, and comforted my soon-to-be wife every step of the way. The saving grace, of course, was that I could put my performance issues down as pre-wedding jitters as the day crept closer and closer. The wedding was easily the happiest day of my life. I stood at the altar, sweating in my rented tux, waiting for the moment she would arrive. The crowd huddled behind me in a murmuring throng of excited tension, and it felt like 1,000 years had passed before the music began from the organist. When I saw her in her dress, gliding down the aisle like a dream, I fell in love all over again. She was beautiful, her tears now ones of joy, and I never regretted asking her to join her life to mine. We exchanged rings, spoke vows of eternal love, and then walked from the church as husband and wife. As we stood for pictures, the venue having set up on the lawn to host our reception, I made ready to fulfill my end of tonight. I drank champagne for toasts and black coffee by the cup. I took caffeine supplements before we climbed into the car and left for our honeymoon suite. As she went into the bathroom to take her dress off, I walked around and tried my best to keep my heart racing. I told myself over and over again that tonight would be different, that tonight would repay for all the rest. I wanted nothing but to make her feel special and to make tonight one to remember. When she came out of the bathroom, the two of us standing before each other as husband and wife, I felt like I was possessed with all the energy and serenity I would ever need. When we woke up the next morning, intertwined as we always were, there were no tears on her cheek, only a look of fulfillment I knew all too well. We settled into married life easily, and it was as though nothing had changed. Despite my best efforts, however, I couldn't recapture the magic of that night. Whenever I was in her arms, whenever we were close, I couldn't help but fall into that feeling of utter serenity and slip off to sleep. It was as if those feelings had multiplied after the wedding. She made me feel like I could die of happiness. I couldn't hold her hand as we drove anymore, lest I find myself listing off the road. If I cuddled on the couch with her to watch a movie, I would inevitably miss over half of it. I loved nothing more than to bask in that feeling of serenity that seemed to waft around her, but I also felt guilty as she seemed to return to her silent, tearful nature. I couldn't help myself. I was powerless to resist the pull of her, and I was powerless to do anything when I was in her arms. I began to notice as her mental health got worse, though. Kathy was moody and manic by turns. Sometimes she wanted nothing to do with me, only to cry and demand my attention. I often missed classes because I was afraid to leave her by herself, and I finally insisted that we go see a doctor. The doctor said this was normal. Her medication just needed to be adjusted. Despite their best efforts, though, the new pills and the adjustment of the old pills seemed to do no good. Our lovemaking was non-existent, despite my best efforts. I tried to comfort her, tried other means of intimacy, attended couples therapy with her, tried my best to keep her from imploding. In the end, though, it did no good. I remember the night it happened as vividly as I remember our wedding day. I was lying in bed, Kathy still in the bathroom, and I was worried about the appointment we had the next day. They planned to try her on a new battery of medications, and Kathy seemed to be willing to give it a try. She had wandered around the house like a fretful ghost all day, and I'd been keeping an eye on her until this very moment. I felt like if we could just get to bed, if we could just fall asleep in the comfortable embrace of each other's arms, everything would be fine. She climbed into bed, and something about her face didn't seem right to me. Then she opened her arms, and I was like a meteorite hurling into a planet's gravity. "I love you," she said, kissing my forehead as her heart raced against my chest. "I'll always love you." I fell asleep, wrapped in the arms of my love, sure that as long as I remained here, everything would be okay. I woke up, however, to discover that I was sleeping next to a corpse. I called the paramedics, but there was nothing they could do. She'd been dead for hours as I slept. Kathy had taken an overdose of sleeping pills before tucking in for the night. It was almost ironic in the end, and the note she had left on the nightstand told me everything I needed to know. All these years, I had believed that I was giving her the same feeling that she was giving me. It turned out I was nothing but a thief in the night. Kathy said that her mental decline had started almost the day we met. The balance and fulfillment that I had been expecting was a mirror to the anxiety that she was feeling. She had taken my inability to stay awake as something she was doing. She was boring me. I was disinterested. She was failing as a woman as a result. The longer it lasted, the more she felt like she was the cause. She wanted to please me, to be a good wife, but the longer it went on, the more inadequate she felt. She loved me. She never wavered in her love for me. But being with someone who was physically uninterested in her was killing her, physically and emotionally. She had finally decided that if sleeping next to her was what I wanted, then she would give me what I wanted. We would both sleep soundly for a change. I'm writing this as I sit in the viewing room of the funeral parlor. They gave me an hour before her cremation, a final viewing for her grieving husband. I could tell by the way they keep looking at me that I must look terrible. I've been awake for the past 5 days, and the bags under my eyes look more like suitcases. I've become accustomed to her presence, to the way she makes me feel, and now my sleep is all but non-existent. I'm like a junkie with no smack, and my fix lies in that box across the way, looking as lovely as the day we met. I think that when I get done with this, I may climb into that simple pine box with her and see if I can find some sleep. I can almost feel whatever she possesses from my seat here, and I want to see if she still possesses it even in death. Who knows? Maybe I'll pull the lid closed behind me, and they'll simply slide me into the chute as well. It seems fitting somehow that the two of us should sleep forever, two souls at rest forever. Have you ever met someone who changed your life so completely? Someone who's your first, your last, your only? I met her once. Her name was Sheela. I worked as an engineer in China. My company hired me straight out of college and offered me a substantial sign-on bonus if I would relocate to the mainland hub. Apparently, the company was responsible for many of the dams across China, and due to poor upkeep, many of the lawsuits leveled against them had been for machinery failure. My job was to check the machinery in the dams and make sure they were working correctly. It's a pretty lucrative job. After a few years, I find myself nearly fluent in the regional dialect. An American is something of a novelty for the people in these rural towns. I often find myself invited to bars or back to someone's house at the end of the day. The women have been very amicable, if not right out flirtatious. I usually don't find it difficult to find female companionship if I want it. Well, I didn't, at least. That was before I met Sheela, though. I was checking on a rather large dam near the coast, one that filters the often polluted river water and keeps debris from reaching the ocean. The dam's been leaking something caustic into the sea for a few months, and it was my job to figure out why it was doing that. I won't bore you with the technical details, but it wasn't hard to figure out what was going on. No one had bothered to dump the holding tanks that collect the pollutants, and they were leaking out into the dam walls and then into the ocean. No one had bothered to tell the workers to dump the tanks either. So a week of work and one pumper barge later, the dam was back up and keeping the ocean clean. That was apparently cause for celebration. The dam workers took me out for a few drinks that night. The local community, heavily centered around the fishing industry, wanted to meet me and thank me. A celebration was held, and I was introduced to everyone from the village mayor to the town priest. The mood was definitely festive, and I remember being handed a small cup of strong liquor early in. The clear liquor was quite potent, and after a while, the night became a jumble of colors and sounds. I danced and laughed and ate some of the best food I'd ever tasted. The whole village was so friendly that, after a while, I forgot to be self-conscious about my height or my nationality, and just let myself be immersed in the moment. I was sitting under an overhang, a fourth cup of the strong liquor at hand, when I saw a goddess approach me. Her hair was pale, not blonde, but white, and her dress was seafoam green and clung to her. She had the eye of every man there, and had the ire of every woman. I remember thinking that she didn't seem to fit the standards of this place. She was tall, almost as tall as me, and her skin was darker, tanned, brown. She looked foreign, vaguely Middle Eastern, and I remembered thinking that she looked like no one I'd ever seen before. She sauntered up to me, her eyes promising things her body was more than capable of keeping, and extended a hand to me. "Dance?" she asked, her voice gliding out like a midnight tide. I reached out, shakily, and took her hand. She pulled me up, not easy to do, considering I'm mostly muscle and 6'2". As the music started, she began to spin me and pull me in time with her own internal beat. We moved as galaxies moved, a solar system unto ourself, and when I looked at her, I could see her barely contained longing. She desired me. She wanted me. And when she pulled me close, I could feel her heart racing in her chest. Her breasts pressed against me through the dress, and her lips slid up my neck. I heard her whisper something in my ear that sent pins down my spine. "Come with me. Come with Sheela." She broke from me then, a teasing finger tempting me away from the dancers. I stumbled after her, the drink and the fire in my nethers piloting me easily. Did you say Sheela? Is that your name?" I slurred, letting her lead me towards the beach. She smiled and kept crooking her finger at me as we left the festivities. She led me through the sprawl of the little dwellings that butted up against the sea, and in my drunken state, I was in no mood to think about what I might be doing. Her pale hair danced in the moonlight, and her tan skin shone so pale it was almost white. It turned her into a ghost, floating along before me as I stumbled on the rutted path. She beckoned me onward, and as I came, I could hear some exotic melody floating around us in the air. Then the dog began to bark, and the melody was snatched away. He wasn't much of a guard dog, some little mutt that had been tied up in someone's yard, but the effect he had on her was jarring. She recoiled as though she had been burned, and took a few shaky steps away from the animal. The dog was lunging at her, straining against its rope, and snarling like a wild thing. He was choking himself trying to get free, and his aggressive behavior seemed aimed solely at my companion. Watching him maul the air was starting to bring me out of my daze. Then Sheela rounded on him and hissing at him like a scalded cat. The dog yarked and backpedaled to hunker under the porch, completely chastised. When she crooked her finger at me, the lovely music began to take me away again. We came to the beach, and she led me to a spot behind a stand of vegetation. There sat a hand-carved wooden boat bobbing in the surf. As I climbed inside, I felt the weight of the drink descend on me. I closed my eyes and felt the boat slip off into the waves. My fingers splashed into the spray when they took to the water, and I remember thinking that we were moving much too fast for a boat she was paddling. I'd seen no motor, and the boat looked like the kind that you would need big oars and strong arms to pilot. As we bobbed and floated in the churning soup, I let my mind focus on the strange music enveloping me, and drifted off for what couldn't have been longer than a few minutes. When I awoke, we were on a very different stretch of sand, and her hands were pressed against my chest, her face very close to mine. She smiled when she saw that I was awake. "Come," she whispered, and was off me and out of the boat with a cat-like grace. I rose from the boat much less gracefully, and as I looked across the water, I could see the lights of the little fishing village many miles away. I looked for the oars, but I didn't see them. I must have been out for hours, because there was no way she could have gone that far in a few minutes. The little boat bobbed in the shallows, having no anchor and no means to stay put either, and that confused me as well. Surely the tide must take it back out again without something to tie it down. Then the warm laughter of my guide and the soft music enveloped me again, and I followed her into the woods. A lush jungle lay not far from the boat, and she was standing at the edge and looking lovely in her green dress. She moved into the tree line, begging to be chased, and in the light of the moon, I dogged her steps as my drink-soaked brain processed only the need to have her. The jungle vegetation was lush and thick. On any other night, I would have been hesitant to plunge into there for fear of snakes or poisonous insects. That night, though, I blundered in with wild abandon, and the deeper I went, the deeper I was pushed to go. When I crashed into a small clearing, a burbling pool splishing placidly, I looked around wildly. She was nowhere to be seen, but I could still hear the music, and I knew she couldn't be far. Suddenly, the burbling became a loud expulsion of water, and she rose from the water like a nymph. I must have looked ghastly myself, one shoe missing, clothes torn and tattered from my wild run, and my face awash with mud and sweat. She approached me, however, as though I were some Greek god. She slid her soft hands over my cheek and pressed her cool lips against mine. She tasted exotic, like oils and spices and something unknown. She tasted like the grave, but I wouldn't know that until later. She broke our kiss and slid her mouth to my ear as she whispered her last request. "Dance for me." I felt my limbs go taut, like a puppet whose strings have been pulled, and suddenly I broke into a wild and frantic sort of dancing. The music in my head changed, becoming primal and dissident. My body threw itself wildly about. My throat erupted in earthy screams of ecstasy. I felt like one of those ravers in a mosh pit as my body danced out its primal need for her. She sat back against a rock, her dress hiking up to show me a pale leg that I was sure had been tanned earlier. Hadn't she looked exotic before? Vaguely Middle Eastern? Now her skin was pale as cream, and her white hair seemed brittle and corpsey as the moon spilled across it. Her dress suddenly seemed more like a funeral shift, and the green became mold as her cat-like eyes stared at me in the throes of my passionate dancing. I was a beast, a man on fire, and as I danced, I felt my limbs exerting themselves to the limits. My legs gave way first, spilling me head first onto the dirt. I rolled over, my arms still trying to dance, and I saw her creep forward like something from a horror movie. She scuttled ghoulishly, on all fours, and my limbs refused to heed any of the commands I was giving them. My legs twitched, trying to dance, but unable, and my arms kept thrashing and hitching feebly as she approached. I could see her staring at me from the soles of my feet as she peeked at me from between my toes. Then she opened her mouth very wide and popped the big toe of my left foot into her mouth. When she opened her mouth, I had seen a double row of sharp teeth that promised to strip my flesh even as they bit through the bone. As the toe entered her mouth, I knew I would never see it again. When she sucked the toe instead, I thought maybe I'd been mistaken. Perhaps she was just playing with me. Maybe the alcohol had made me hallucinate, and this was nothing but a gin-soaked dream. Then she bit the toe, parting it from my body as she chewed with an ecstatic look on her cannibal's face. I cried out, but my cries mixed well with the dance's primal scream. No one would hear me out here anyway. We were miles from civilization. Even the fishermen on their boat that might be close would probably think I was a strange night bird. No one was coming to my rescue, and my body had betrayed me in the wake of the strange song. I was her plaything, her prisoner, and she could do with me as she liked. The other 4 toes of that foot went down simultaneously. She crunched them with relish, her serpentine tongue sliding out to lick the blood from her lips. When the toes were gone, she took a bite of the now oddly shaped foot. The blood ran darkly from the nub, and she lapped at it hungrily as she chewed. My throat felt raw from screaming, the pain intense and throbbing, and as she took a second bite, I heard my voice giving out from crying. She looked up at me, seductively enough to make certain parts of my body quiver, and began planting biting kisses up my leg. The wounds were red and oozing, her lips now painted in my blood, and as she bit her way up, I began to realize her destination. I tried to break free of her spell, not wanting to be parted from that particular portion of my body, but I was helpless before her. She kissed her way up my leg, her mouth splitting and the cheeks ripping at the corners as she prepared to bite through the front of my trousers. Then a dog howled somewhere in the jungle, and she cast her eyes fearfully towards it. She stared in the direction for nearly a minute, seeming unsure of herself. She was rattled. The dog's howl had put her off, just like the one on the mainland had. She stared out into the forest, eyes searching frantically. When nothing came running out of the jungle to challenge her, though, she turned back to her helplessly dancing victim. I'll save you the gory details. Needless to say, it was the worst pain of my life. I watched her throat bulge as she swallowed them down, a look of pure bliss on her face. My warm blood pattered down her placid face as she closed her eyes and basked in the taste of me. She looked up then, cat eyes searching, and I thought she might be seeing my heart as it beat in my chest. She licked the blood from her lips and stalked up my chest, grabbing my arms and holding them down fiercely, so my feebly swinging arms couldn't hinder her. Her mouth tore open at the corners again, and I closed my eyes against the oncoming rip of her two sharp teeth. The various wounds ached and bled, and at that moment I was almost glad that it was about to end. I just wanted the pain to stop. That's when I heard the howl, closer now than it had been, and something big slammed into her side. It knocked her off me, sending her squealing and hissing and driving her weight off of my hurting body. When I opened my eyes, I realized that it wasn't a dog at all. It was a wolf, a big black wolf with white snarling teeth and a pair of piss-yellow eyes that looked furious. My mind was a jumble. I didn't remember hearing about wolves in China, but I was far from upset by his sudden appearance. He leapt onto the woman and tore into her with his snarling maw. She hissed at him, slapping at him with her long nails, but as she showed some signs of driving him off, another wolf barreled from the jungle to join the first. As I lay bleeding, 8 of the largest wolves I had ever seen came snarling from the vegetation to ring her in. She looked at them. As her eyes met with mine, her face was full of fear. They buried her in a ring of ripping teeth and furry bodies. I didn't waste time. I dragged myself away from the clearing with what little strength I had left, making for the beach that had been so close when I had 2 whole feet. As I pulled myself away, I could hear them tearing and ripping at her, her screams driving into my brain like an ice pick. If you've never heard someone get mauled to death by a pack of wolves, consider yourself very lucky. I could hear them savaging her as I bled and crawled, and I had no illusions of getting far before they fell on me as well. I was leaving a clear enough blood trail and panting loud enough to be heard from the mainland. As the sounds of their feast became farther away, I began to think I might be allowed to die in the jungle instead of eaten alive by wolves. I had no hope of finding the beach again. I only knew that I didn't want to die as she had. When my fingers sank into the sand an undeterminable amount of time later, I drew them back in surprise. I had never expected to find the beach, and now that the sound of water engulfed me, I knew I might be allowed to die on the beach in relative comfort. I dug my body out onto that beach, my various injuries crying out as the sand caked them and was ground into them. I dragged myself forward until I could feel the shore's wet edge, and then rolled onto my back and lay where the water might slide up and touch me as I was dying. It was cold fire against my injured foot, but I didn't care. The sound of waves would be a perfect backdrop for my last few minutes on Earth. I could still feel the blood leaking out of my foot and crotch, and knew I had lost a lot of it. I closed my eyes and prepared to die, when my eyelids were suddenly blasted by a bright light. I thought it was the sun for one pain-soaked moment. I thought I had fallen into a pain-induced shock and come to the beach by day, but when the lights went away, I opened my eyes in confusion. The light returned a moment later, and I shaded my eyes to see it wasn't the sun, but a searchlight. As it slid away, I saw it was on a little ship that was cruising towards the coast. When I flopped back down and closed my eyes again, it fell on me and it held me in its regard. I heard people yelling, speaking in the native tongue, and there was a splash of boats being lowered into the water. I tried to struggle when they came for me, fearing that they were with her, but my body had reached its limits. I blacked out as the strong hands lifted me from the sand. The last thing I remember was feeling my back on the hardwood and wondering if it would be the last thing I ever felt. I woke up on the mainland, though. I had been asleep for 3 days. The doctors told me that some fishermen from the village had heard me screaming and come to see if they could help. My left foot was 60% gone. My left leg was in danger of needing amputation since some of the bites had festered. My groin was a tube now. My reproductive organs were bitten off completely, and I was fortunate to be alive. Any longer, and you would have likely bled to death. As I lay in the clean white hospital room, being told I would likely lose my leg and had lost the thing that at my age made me a man, I didn't feel so fortunate. The police came and asked me questions about what had happened, but you could tell they didn't believe me. The island I had been found on was private property, a nature preserve, and no one in the area ever went there for fear of the animals that lived there. They sounded like they thought I was a weirdo, some sex freak that had gone a little too far, and when I told them that the wolves had eaten the woman who had done this, they scoffed. If the fishermen in the village hadn't corroborated my story about leaving with a woman, they would have likely assumed I had done this to myself. I'd still be in the dark if the old man hadn't come to visit. He told me his name was Lee, and he had been one of the fishermen who had found me on the island. They had left the party after his brother had told them who I had gone off with. He said I was fortunate to be alive. Many people who ran across the Sheela were not so lucky. The what? I asked. Sheela. They are old creatures that live on the island. They are spirits, he said, trying to find the words to explain it. Not like our spirits, but still spirits. They come from the union of a spirit of air and a human. They feed on human flesh and love to entice their prey to a secluded area so they can extend their time with them. You said creature. You mean there are more of them? I asked, horrified. He nodded. We lose men to the island sometimes. Many villages do. Like you, some come back scarred and broken, saved by the wolves who hate the Sheela. You are very lucky, son. Never forget that. I lay back in bed, cold and wanting to throw up, thinking of others who had been lured to the island and devoured by that hateful thing. That was 2 weeks ago. The doctors say I will get to keep my leg, but there's nothing they can do about my situation below the belt. My company has offered to pay my hospital bills and sent over paperwork for a sizable settlement if I don't pursue any legal action for being hurt on the job. I told them I hadn't been injured on the job, but they don't seem to want to take any chances. The settlement will be more than enough to get home and start some semblance of a new life. I can't do what I used to do with one foot, so that part of my life is clearly behind me. So many things are behind me now. I tell my story not to elicit pity, but to warn those who might travel to this part of the world. Be careful who you follow home. That pretty face might hide some sharp teeth, and you might find yourself following your date back to her lair. There are Sheela out there still, and I can attest that their hunger and their cruelty are not like anything you've ever seen before. Be careful, and don't be her next victim. I've been an artist for a few years now. I went to school with people whose understanding of art stopped at watercolors and still lifes, but those never really were my thing. I like to be experimental in my work, really push the boundaries of art. My high school art teacher, Mr. Caff, never really understood that, but it's probably hard to understand much of anything with your head firmly crammed up your backside. He was one of those types who thought the Renaissance was the birth and death of the artistic expression, and that digital art was tantamount to blasphemy. He did not tolerate modern art in his classroom, and I likely wouldn't still be doing art if it wasn't for Terry. Terry and I met in art class freshman year, and we've been friends ever since. Terry is your textbook manic pixie dream girl, and her artistic medium is pop art with a soft spot for comics. She did all those reimaginings of classic comic covers, always in heavy oils and deep, saturated colors, and her work is really something to behold. Mr. Caff may not have understood her medium, but he understood her process, so she made straight B's in his class. I have a theory that he was trying to get into her ripped blue jeans, but manic pixie dream girls rarely fall for the middle-aged high school teacher, so tough break, Teach. The old bastard tried to fail me, on the other hand, but I rose above it, and now I'm one of the most well-known modern artists in the city, likely to his chagrin. My art is far from what you'd consider classical. I make sculptures from various mediums, do charcoal prints, weird displays of paints and acrylics, and recently I've begun doing metalwork sculptures and something I'm calling transitory mundane. The basic premise is that you take something normal, a refrigerator or a couch or a TV, and make it utterly mind-blowing. My horror fridge took first place at last year's Fall Gala, and my TV Apocalypse made the paper earlier this year. This time, however, I've got something really interesting in mind. Terry raised an eyebrow as I pulled the cover off my latest art project. I call it the Infinity Table. Terry looked dubiously at the rectangular living room table, a thick piece of glass sitting propped over a dark opening. It just looks like a regular table to me. I'm not sure what kind of concept you're going for, but I don't get it. I grinned as I leaned down, flicking a switch as the inside lit up to reveal the trick. Through mirror placement and strategic lighting, the inside of the table resembles nothing so much as a black pit that proceeds downward into infinity. A ladder was installed on the side and seemed to descend down into the pit. The mirror magnified it on and into the void. Terry's jaw dropped open as she oohed appreciatively over the illusion. The rocks on the walls and the crystal lighting, a really nice touch if I do say so myself. That is so cool! It's so simple yet intriguing. Everyone's going to want one after the show next week. But only one of them will get it. I think this may be my greatest art piece yet. The two of us cackled over my brilliance, and Terry told me about the panel series she planned to do for her own entry. Terry had been hard at work on an original comic series, so tired of bringing others' works to life and not getting to work on her own stuff. She was debuting a series of oil paintings from her own personal collection, and she hoped they would drum up some interest for upcoming series. I was listening, really I was, but my eyes kept being drawn back down to that yawning chasm that lay in the center of the table. It was an illusion. I knew it was an illusion. I had made it after all. But I couldn't keep myself from feeling the sightless black eye as it stared at me. It had discomforted me before, the way a scary movie makes you shiver even after it's over, but I always managed to shrug it off. I had created the illusion. I knew it wasn't real, but I could still swear that something lurked within it. I knew it didn't, but it still intrigued me. I was like a bird that knows the bag will trap him, but still wants to know what lies inside. Like a man who knows that the void stares back, but goes right on staring. Hello? Are you even listening to me? I shook myself back and apologized for spacing out. I flipped the light out on the table, and it was once again reduced to a black crater. Even turned off, I still felt like I could feel that inky mass looking at me, and I didn't like the crawling, scrabbling way it seemed to contemplate me. It had never looked at me like this during its creation, and it seemed to have gained a life of its own with its completion. It's cool and all, but I'm kinda glad you turned it off. I looked up as Terry shuddered, and the discomfort was an alien concept on her normally whimsical face. It scares me a little bit. I smiled, but I knew all too well what she meant. That's why Terry was my best friend. It was sometimes like we shared a brain. How did you even come up with something like this? She asked, still sounding equal parts terrified and amazed. I started to rattle off something about pure talent or the muse at work, but I honestly couldn't remember how I had thought of it. Had it been in a dream? It seemed like I had been inspired by something to build this piece, but I couldn't remember what. I had been so driven the last few weeks to finish it that I never really stopped to think why. Hello, you spacing out on me again? Terry laughed, snapping her fingers in front of my face. I shook my head, getting a grip before answering. Just the muse at work, I guess. I took her out for drinks then, wanting to forget about the feeling that dark eye had given me, as much as she did, but it was never far from my mind. When I stumbled back that night, the few drinks turning into a few too many drinks, I stood over the table and looked down into the dark, unlit eye. Even drunk, I felt the regard of that hateful space, and it sobered me a little. I could feel it staring at me through the flimsy haze that lay between us, and the dark hole seemed to long for its freedom again. I reached for the switch with a shaky hand, the mechanism snapping crisply as it came to life. The light came on, but it was cold comfort. The hole stretched into the earth, a dark and gaping maw that filled me with dread. Why had I created this thing? How did it occur to me to make such a hateful portal? How had I conceptualized this? the longer I looked into it, the more certain I became that I could see something at the bottom. It seemed to move within the dark eye, with frantic, herky-jerky movements. It moved like something in a claymation cartoon, and its regard was like wasps crawling on my skin. I didn't know what it was, couldn't even tell you how big it was, but as my hands trembled back towards the switch, I saw one thing for sure. It had begun to climb the ladder. The light snapped off with a smart pop, and I was left once more with only the dark haze across the glass. I went to bed, but my dreams were plagued by that bottomless eye and that thing that moved within. I didn't turn it on again until the day of the show. I honestly debated just pushing it into an alley behind my apartment and forgetting it ever existed, but I had too much time and money invested in the project to just walk away. The components hadn't come without a cost, and the prize money, not to mention the money I would make once it was sold, would allow me to do art for another few months. If it flopped at the show, I might have to actually find a job, and that would be the biggest blow to the art community imaginable. So I loaded it into the back of my ratty old pickup, the camper allowing it to ride in relative safety, and drove it to the gallery. I had secured it with a rope, not wanting it to tip over and break, despite my misgivings. I could tell myself that I kept checking the rear view the whole time just to make sure it wasn't getting damaged, but that was a lie. I wanted to make sure that nothing simply climbed out of it as I drove through the crowded streets of Seattle to what I hoped would be a feather in the cap of my career. My neighbor had helped me load the table. Beefy neighbors have to be good for something, right? And thankfully, there were burly men in black security shirts to help me unload it. They did most of the unloading and reloading onto the hand dolly too, which was good because it had taken everything I had to put my hands on it as we loaded it into the truck. It had sat like a revered monolith in my living room for the past week. After I had woken up that first morning to a hangover and the sunlight illuminating the pit under that all-too-thin pane of glass, I had covered it with a tarp. I hadn't touched it, hadn't said anything on it, hadn't even let my feet lean against it the whole week, and the thought of its surface against my skin made me feel crawly. I couldn't remember why I had been so excited about this thing, and only a feeling of deep revulsion filled me when I looked at it. If no one bought it, I had decided I would donate it to the gallery after the show. At least I could write that off on my taxes. Terry waved at me as she saw me coming in, and her little bird arms seemed ready to pop as she wrapped them around me. "I see you didn't get rid of it," she said with a smile, though her voice sounded strained. Terry wouldn't say so, but she seemed to feel the same trepidation I felt around the piece. I figured that someone would buy it, and who knows, the judges might really like it. She showed me her prints, scenes of dramatic heroes poised for battle, and spiraling cityscapes that oozed adventure, and I made the appropriate noises over them. It was always impressive what she could do with oils and paints, but tonight she had really outdone herself. I gave her another hug, wishing her luck as I pushed my hateful table over to the area that had been designated for me. A passing pair of lost frat boys helped me get it off the dolly, and far too soon I was left alone with this blight upon the world. I didn't turn it on. I honestly didn't really want to look at it, and I just contented myself to stand there as people bustled by and set up their own pieces for the show. 20 minutes later, my mind wandering, someone called my name, and I turned to find a stern-faced woman looking down at my piece. "What is it?" she asked, a ribbon on her shirt letting me know that, though she wasn't a judge, she was still very important. The ribbon let everyone know that she was a contributor, the color putting her in a high tier. "It's called an infinity table," I told her, her scowl not impressed. I reached down, my fingers trembling, and flipped the switch. I expected to see an angry something looking back at me, the glass bearing long cracks where something had battered it from the other side. But instead, it was just the same dark eye as always. It regarded the two of us with an unfriendly familiarity, and the stern-looking woman looked impressed as she took it all in. Very interesting. Not my style, but very interesting. You should leave it on if you want anyone to buy it. The endless tunnel is a definite selling point. I waited for her to move away before switching it off again. She had a point. If I wanted to get rid of this hateful thing, I needed people to see what it could do. The fear of something climbing out of it seemed silly now, as all these people stood around me, but it was a silly feeling that wouldn't abate. In the end, my greed overrode my fear, and I flipped it on so I could draw in some interest. Interest I found. People came over to have a look, and there was a fair amount of oohing and ahhing. They asked how I had done it, wanted one of their own, but I told them it was a one-of-a-kind piece and would likely carry a steep price tag. All the while, my eyes kept flitting back to the crevice in the center of the table, as though I expected to see something crawl up from the depths. I could see, or at least I imagined I could see, the stunted figure as he stalked about at the bottom of the pit. It was trapped there. This was its prison, and now I had given it a means of escape. I had invited it out of the pit, and now it could come into our world, and wow, how did you ever come up with something so cool? I started. Someone new had come up to ask about the infinity table, and I told them again about the concept. It all sounded so false to me now. I hadn't come up with the concept, though I could certainly talk about it in an educated manner. What a smart little bird I was. I could talk oh so prettily about my new project, using all the right buzzwords and trendy lingo to catch all these yuppies' attention. I was an artist. I created art, but I was beginning to feel like something else. This was beginning to feel like I was being used. Despite these misgivings, the show was going pretty well. People loved the infinity table. They thought it was really cool and a great perspective piece. I had a few tentative offers, but nothing serious. I would have probably taken the first offer, but the hole in the table kept distracting me. As I talked to people, I could see the small something beginning to climb the ladder again. It was still very small, like a fly crawling on a window pane, but as it climbed, it got larger and larger with each rung it grabbed. There was no way this could be real. I had built the thing. There was no hole in the void. It was all an optical illusion. Even so, the small creature was climbing up and up and up as these stupid airheads talked on and on about how much they loved my table. "Hey, you okay?" I jumped, realizing I'd been staring at the table for nearly 5 minutes. Terry was there, a well-dressed man grinning on her arm. Terry wasn't tall, but this guy looked like he might have had some hobbits in his family tree. He was short, hairy, dressed in a luxury white suit with a gold chain and a lot of very aggressive chest hair. I wasn't certain I could smell him. There were a lot of sweaty bodies, mine chief among them, but there was a definite tang of musky cologne and fragrant soap. Terry was smiling, but the smile looked paper-thin as the man, whom I was already calling Leisure Suit Larry in my head, rubbed his arm against her hip. "This is Clive," she said, indicating Larry as she slid herself free of him. "He liked my art so much that he decided to buy all 5 pieces. I just knew he had to see your infinity table, so I brought him over here to have a look." Translation, Leisure Suit Larry was Loaded Larry, and she was hoping she could solve both our problems. Larry had sized me up as she spoke, and I could feel my skin crawl under his less than altruistic stare. "I consider myself a lover of art, amongst other things. Did you make this?" he asked, looking down into the table as his eyes seemed to dazzle as they took in the sight of the gaping pit. "I did," I began, but before I could say anything else, I looked down at the table and felt my throat constrict. He was bigger now, the size of a thumbprint, and climbing fast. He was speeding up, climbing rapidly, and I wasn't sure how the others couldn't see him. Did they not see the shadowy little creature as it grew from a thumbprint to the size of a silver dollar? Larry was saying something, complimenting my work, but all I could focus on was the growing spot of black as it climbed like a mad thing. "I'm sold, love," he said to Terry, the word love making her flinch. "I'll pay you 30,000 for it." I couldn't speak. My throat was a stupid machine, incapable of doing anything but killing me slowly. The thing was twice as large now, growing quickly. I had no clue what I would do if it got to the glass and just started banging on that thin sheet of tempered material. Larry was looking right at it, his nose inches from the tabletop. How could he not see it? Playing hard to get, huh? Okay, 40,000 then. I could make out the top of its head, its face turned up to look at the land above. Its eyes were like twin coals, its mouth open in a leering grin, and its hands were covered in hair or tar or something. Its body was like an undiluted shadow, a golem of darkness that was climbing like a fiend to get at the lighted world above. It seemed like I might have unintentionally created performance art, I thought with a weak little gasp. Escape from purgatory in real life. Terry slid her hand into mine and squeezed, bringing me out of my panic. "What's wrong?" she whispered, seeing my face and sensing my fear. "You're a tease, aren't you?" Larry said, looking up from the table coyly. Fine, but 50,000 is as high as I'll go unless you agree to have drinks with me after the show. Then I might be willing to go up to 60. Sold, I squeaked out, afraid he would take it all back and leave me with this thing. He extended a hand over the table. As I shook it, I could see the creature's face coming closer and closer to the top. I pumped his arm twice before bending down to snap the light off. Can you take it now? I asked him, my voice sounding frantic even to my own ears. Don't you want the judges to see it? Terry asked, a little confused. The panel of 3 judges were just coming to the display area, but I didn't want this thing close to me for more than a second. The hell with the judges. The fear inside me was like a starving weasel, and I feared it would burst through my chest any minute. Can you? I asked again, looming over him. He nodded dumbly, taking out his checkbook and scrawling out a business check. I took it, and he pulled out his cell phone as he made some calls. He excused himself, and before Terry could ask any more questions, I pocketed the check and left the gallery. I met her later for drinks, and she said Larry had excused himself after the purchase. He said he wanted to get it loaded and set up in his own exhibition right away. I think you scared him with your intensity a little. We laughed about it then, my soul lighter now that I didn't have to look at that hateful table anymore. I hadn't thought about that table until yesterday, about a week and a half after the gala. The check had been cashed, and the money had easily floated my art career for the next few years. I'd paid some bills, paid my outstanding credit card debt, and began living pretty comfortably off the excess. I was sitting on my couch, watching Netflix and eating a bowl of cereal for dinner, when my phone buzzed. It was Terry. She had sent me a news article along with a message telling me that I should watch it. Your art piece just made the news in New York, she told me, and the lack of emojis and lols made me a little wary. I opened it up to find an article about a murder at the gallery of Clive Foreman. The proprietor, Mr. Foreman, had been found dead in his gallery in Soho Tuesday morning. He appeared to have been drowned, though no water could be found in his lungs or on the ground around him. Doctors say it's as though he simply drowned on the floor of his gallery and was left there. The next picture was of a very familiar table. It had been broken, and the glass lay gaping and jagged like an untreated wound. The article went on to say that the murderer had left a message on the wall in either tar or some kind of oil, and as I scrolled to the next picture, I felt the phone slip out of my numb hand. The message on the wall seemed to glower at me from the floor, and I drew my knees up to my chest as I tried to make myself stop hyperventilating. It read, "Your muse is free. My prison is no more."